Chapter 448. These veterans knew very well that because Sulu had brought the nation's maiden to planet 5460, this secret mission for the Bureau of Proclamation was the first time Team 7 had been sent out on a mission in this war. Therefore, they could feel what Sulu's serious distribution of cigarettes meant. It was the smoke from the battlefield steeped in alcohol. Listening to the noises of the rookies in the auditorium behind them, they became even more silent. They lowered their heads and smoked without saying a word, their expressions firm and calm. Team 7 had a total of 21 members. Before they could finish distributing, the dark blue number 37 brand cigarettes had already been distributed. Bai Yulan smiled slightly and took out her own number 37 brand cigarettes from her pocket. She held one in her mouth and gave one to Lan Xiaolong beside her. Sulu held the cigarette in his mouth and opened the map of planet 163's surface from the electronic manual. Through the somewhat dazzling smoke, he looked at the work area marked in green and narrowed his eyes slightly. If the military's air support could be timely and powerful, reconstructing the glory of the charter in this 3,200 square kilometer area would not be a difficult task. At least, his troops would not have to be like Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division, fighting from Yellow Mountain Ridge all the way to the Northern Hemisphere. It was so tragic that it made one's hair stand on end. When can the Westwoods Military District send the 3D topographic map over? They should be able to get it when we get on the warship, Bai Yulan replied. The Imperial Expeditionary Force has occupied this planet for more than 40 years. Although they can't heavily guard every area on the planet, we still have to go deep into enemy territory, which is very dangerous. The most troublesome thing is that the Bureau of Proclamation's lowest level of electronic surveillance network setup is a bit complicated even for a professional engineer like me. These guys in the auditorium have only learned it for 10 days. Can they meet the minimum requirements? From the battle mobilization to the argument with his friends, it was rare for him to talk so much tonight, but he still had to continue. He rubbed his somewhat dry throat and asked. Everyone looked at Gu Shifeng at the same time. This young man with delicate features was the electronics technician of Group 7. These few days, the training in the military camp had been arranged by him. Gu Shifeng adjusted her crooked military cap and looked at Sulu as she replied, reporting to supervisor, I once did a secret mission for the Bureau of Proclamation. The installation of the electronic equipment may seem troublesome, but it can be broken down into a clear isolation process. During the training, I've already divided the recruits into 6 groups for teaching. All they need to do is to repeat some monotonous laying techniques. If the Bureau of Proclamation officials can meet up with us on the planet, there shouldn't be a problem after a few days of intensive training. Sulu then looked at Xiong Linquan. Xiong Linquan said in a low voice, their physical condition is very bad now. The past 10 days have been too rough, and the acidic substances accumulated in their muscle fibers are too strong. Although they have taken a lot of medicine, they can't digest it in a short time. However, if they can have 5 days of buffer time on the warship, then I can guarantee that when we arrive at planet 163, these old soldiers will be in their best condition. Bai Yulan softly interjected, right now, the space channel is too dense. Even if it's an emergency military mission, it will take at least 5 days to get to planet 163 from the main planet. Sulu silently and quickly flipped through the electronic manual. In the end, he raised his head and glanced at Ho Xiandong, the medical officer of Group 7. Ho Xiandong laughed self-deprecatingly and said, the Westwoods has used up all of the stimulants, but it won't be difficult to replenish them. Actually, the quality of these old soldiers is a bit beyond my expectations. Probably because their families are too rich, their bodies that look like they've been drained by alcohol and women are actually very healthy. It's just that they look a bit miserable. As for Yen Bingyen and those bodybuilders, they're so healthy that it makes one's hair stand on end. Right, they'll probably be dead drunk tonight, but it shouldn't be a big problem. Sulu and everyone else laughed. He looked at the haggard and tired faces of his subordinates beside him and knew that they had worked extremely hard these past few days. A faint sense of guilt rose in his heart. If it weren't for his background as a supervisor, the Federation government wouldn't have chosen Group 7 to do this extremely troublesome mission. while feeling guilty, he also felt extremely proud. Looking at these tanned and determined faces, he was very proud that his battle companions were the most professional group of people on the battlefield. Lan Xiaolong took a deep drag on his cigarette, threw it to the ground, and stepped on it to catch his breath. He looked at Su Lu and said with a shrug, "In order to let these young masters survive, we've done everything we can. What happens on the battlefield is something that we can't control. Just do your best, don't be too stressed." "I don't feel any pressure. Life and death on the battlefield is the fairest." Su Lu lowered his head and took a deep breath of the slightly hot smoke. He said with a hoarse voice, just like what Master Schiller said in that traveling swordsman's play, "No matter how many eggs are used, each will kick the rice." Lan Xiaolong shrugged and said with disgust, "I hated that play the most, especially after the male lead was kicked by his junior sister. I sulked in my bed for 2 days and 2 nights, feeling so bitter that my whole body felt uncomfortable." Su Lu looked at him and thought of how he felt when he watched that play when he was young. He thought of those sour eyes that belonged to youth and couldn't help but feel like he knew Xiong Linquan well. But compared to the life and death of the artillery fire in the West Woods, those sour feelings were actually so young and inexperienced. "Rest early, we're leaving tomorrow." Su Lu patted Xiong Linquan's broad shoulder and said, "Our Group 7 can't live so sullenly on the battlefield." The crowd dispersed and the auditorium fell silent. There were old soldiers who were drunk in life and dreaming of death, members of Group 7 who were sleeping on their pillows, people who were quietly sitting by the window and carefully wiping their knives and bayonets, and people who were under the stars in the sky. Su Lu looked at the dazzling curtain of stars in the night sky and blinked his left eye. He said to the old man in his heart with a smile, "I'm going to plant the seeds for you." Then he saw the words "thank you" with his left eye. There was a shiny cobblestone that was washed by the river and shattered into pieces. It was like the most famous spicy hot pot in the capital special district. It was heartbreaking and painful. Then more stones were shattered into pieces. The yellow sand and black soil in front of the temporary bulletproof pit jumped up and sputtered sorrowfully. It sprayed on people's bodies and covered them with a thin but scorching layer. Xipeng's fingers pinched hard on the soil mixed with blood in front of him and quickly and helplessly gasped for breath. Through the transparent helmet in front of him, he looked at the dense white lines of bullet marks above his head and listened to the sharp screeching sound. His whole body was completely stiff. Although his body was full of strength, there was no way for him to use his nervous system to command his bones and muscles to make the correct response. A second ago, his comrade beside him was hit by a few bullets from the Empire. Blood spurted into a beautiful straight line. At that moment, Xipeng turned his head in shock and found that, just like in the movies, his comrade's heavy body was hit by a few high-speed bullets and flew back at a high speed. It was like a bag of flour that was hit by a heavy blow and then began to spray flour. Was this a real battlefield? Xipeng buried his head in the soil and trembled in fear. His eyes began to gradually disperse. He did not see his comrade holding a Qian machine gun and counterattacking with flames, nor did he hear what a veteran was roaring angrily not far away. He could only hear the dense roar of the Empire's guns and cannons. He could only see the churning and sputtering soil in front of him from time to time. He could only see the terrifying and disgusting color of human blood in the soil. After all, he had learned some things from the military camp when he was in that shady 83-84 unit in the Harbor City Garrison Guard District. In the 10 days before he came to this planet, he was tortured by those ruthless mercenaries and was forced to learn even more countermeasures on the battlefield. As the only male in the family of the Deputy Speaker of the Federation, he was without a doubt a real first-rate rich kid. In the prosperous capital ring, in the bizarre world of senses, he had seen blood, drugs, and even death. However, when he came to the front line of the West Woods, he realized that what he had seen before was fake. Between the whistling bullets and the smoke, he was a little absent-minded. He had completely forgotten the tactical manuals that he had learned. He only knew that he was as stiff as a piece of wood and as cowardly as an ostrich under the fortification, not daring to raise his head at all. Wiping the blood on his face with the most careful movements, he looked at half of his finger that was only 10 centimeters away from his lips. Breathing in the scorching air, he suddenly had the urge to vomit. W3 Team, retreat at full speed. A voice sounded in the field infantry communication system. At this moment, on the battlefield that was full of bullets and whistles, this voice was so clear and calm. It was so calm that there was a sense of indifference to life and death. It was like a young lady in a top club in the capital's special zone, using an indifferent tone to evaluate the bloody wild beef in front of her. Inside the Silan military camp, Shi Peng and many others were already incomparably familiar with this voice. It was because this voice had once made them roll on piles of shit, blister all over under the scorching sun, and gave them endless humiliation and torment. But at this moment, this voice in their ears was as pleasant as the music that floated from the sky. Yes, W3 Team. In the face of the parallel fire of the Imperium's light armor troops, W3 Team had the best chance of survival by retreating in two flanks. Shi Peng felt that she was awakened from a nightmare by this voice. Her right hand trembled as she pried open the broken finger in front of her and found her gun from the foamy dust. After a few rapid breaths, she suddenly turned around and ran to the back of the camp. The gunshots sounded behind her, louder and clearer than the beating of her heart. With a pale face, Shi Peng ran desperately like a rabbit and crossed a gentle slope behind the simple fortification. With a bang, she fell heavily into the muddy water. The dirty muddy water flowed down from the infantry's helmet and blocked his vision. She desperately wiped the muddy water off her helmet, but she could only vaguely see the smoke around her. She did not know where to go at all. In an instant, a feeling of despair rushed into her chest, making her legs feel like they were filled with lead. She increasingly felt that the gunshots of the Imperium behind her were like countless rapid, life-threatening drumbeats. She stood at the bottom of the gentle slope in a daze. She seemed to hear the sound of the Imperium's armored vehicles around her, and then she heard a whooshing sound. A palm slapped her hard on the cheek, creating a clear and crisp sound through the hard helmet. Shi Peng was heavily knocked to the ground. Almost at the same time, an Imperium's light-guided rocket flew over with a whoosh and burst into flames in front of her. She looked back in shock. Su Lu, whose face was full of smoke and dust, panted and said, "Show us the map and retreat to the red dot." Chapter 449. In order to win the space war with the Federation, for the past 70 years, His Majesty had not hesitated to incite internal strife, squeezing productivity to the extreme, ignoring the 7 long years of interstellar travel, and continuously sending a huge amount of manpower and material resources, millions of Imperial soldiers and hundreds of millions of tons of supplies, to the front line of the West Woods. Despite such great determination and courage, the Imperial Expeditionary Force still could not achieve a decent victory. In the end, they could only hide in 3 planetary systems and linger on with their last breaths. That was because the Federation had the glory of the Charter. With the multi-layer surveillance network everywhere, the Federation could control all the military operations of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. No matter how secretive these operations were, they could not escape the eyes of the glory of the Charter. The central computer underground in the Federation's capital special district had unimaginable calculation, or as it was called, deduction ability. With the help of the central computer, the mobilization of the Federal Army could be achieved to the maximum extent of instantaneous and automatic. It was like a battle between 2 experts. One of them had a black cloth over his eyes, while the other could see all the movements of his opponent clearly. How could such a battle be fought? The Imperial soldiers had launched several desperate and frenzied attacks, but in the end, they were still forced to retreat under the cold glare of the glory of the Charter. Fortunately, during the last war, they had completely destroyed the surveillance network in the 2 semi-planetary systems of the Federation, so they had a temporary place to rest and recuperate. These 2 semi-planetary systems were the 3,320 planetary systems, the 163 planetary systems, and half of the 5,460 planetary systems. The war that broke out at the end of the 1960s of the constitutional calendar was a huge military operation named Victory. The strategic goal that had to be achieved was to drive the invaders of the Empire away from the 2.5 planets that they had occupied for decades. In order to achieve this strategic goal, and to reduce the terrifying investment of military resources and the number of deaths of soldiers as much as possible, the first thing that the Federation military authorities had to do was, of course, without a doubt, to reconstruct the heavy surveillance network so that the glory of the Charter could shine through the darkness at the edge of the West Woods again, so that the Imperial Expeditionary Force hiding on the 3 planets would become a black spot that was not new under the sun. There was nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. Since the flames of war ignited on the 5,460 planetary system, the federal military began to speed up the pace of reconstructing the Charter network. Countless highly sensitive self-changing orbit satellites were released into space by warships, and countless miniature electronic positioning devices were scattered in the grasslands, forests, and oceans. However, in the decades of war, millions of Imperial soldiers had died because of the glory of the Charter. The Imperial Expeditionary Force had always been extremely vigilant against the Federation's electronic surveillance network. How could they allow the Federal Army to reconstruct the network right under their noses? It was like countless chains strangling their throats. On the basis of the lack of fleets and long-range missiles, the Imperial armies developed powerful anti-surveillance methods and concealment technologies to counter the highly sensitive satellites. They also mastered the method to find and destroy those miniature electronic positioning devices in an extremely short amount of time. Therefore, the federal military needed to lay out the low-frequency band network on the ground, and this required a large number of ground engineering units to complete. In order to avoid the intensive electronic surveillance of the Imperial armies and avoid the unreasonable and crazy destruction of the newly laid surveillance network by the enemy, the ground engineering units could not even mobilize heavy armored units, let alone eye-catching mechas. Before the Federation's main forces landed on the surface of the planet, there were already many such engineering units that took great risks and quietly snuck in. The 7th Team of the Shell Motor Company was one of the inconspicuous units. The 7th Combat Team was not very lucky. After arriving at Planet 163, they immediately threw themselves into the work of repairing the glory of the Charter. Today was the first time they carried out the task of laying out the surveillance network. Temporarily under the jurisdiction of the 3rd Battle Area Command in the West Woods, they left the temporary air transport transfer point in the morning and spent half a day hurriedly completing the installation of the equipment in the designated area. However, no one would have thought that on the way back, less than 10 kilometers away from the light battleship pickup point, they unluckily encountered an Imperial Expeditionary Force patrol unit. The encounter was a coincidence. Presumably, the Imperial Patrol Unit also did not expect to encounter a group of sneaky Federation people in this beautiful landscape. It was already very unlucky to encounter the enemy on the way back from their first mission. However, the 7th Combat Team was even more unlucky because the Imperial Patrol Unit they encountered was actually a light armored unit. Bullets whizzed past the top of his head. Sulu held a standard precision gun with both hands and leaned his back against the simple fortification above the gentle slope. He lowered his head and did not move. From the corner of his eyes, he saw his subordinates retreating under the cover of the heavy machine guns. His mood was slightly relieved. This was also the first time he had encountered a real battle. In the Yellow Mountain range of Planet 5460, operating a mecha to fight was completely different from just wearing the equipment for individual soldiers. However, for some reason, he narrowed his eyes, listened to the sound of guns and cannons, and smelled the faint burnt smell of gunpowder. He did not feel any sense of panic. It was as if the dangerous battlefield was originally the place that his big heart was most familiar with. He used his left hand to pull a thin rope on the edge of his bulletproof vest. The end of the rope was a video storage device about the size of a fingernail. He gently placed it on the floating soil that was shaken up by the cannonball. Half a second later, the image of the situation below the gentle slope appeared on the small ultra-thin light screen in front of Shan Chio's helmet. There were 11 Imperial heavy armored tanks charging toward the position at high speed. The ground trembled slightly with the roar. In the middle of the tank formation, there were hundreds of Imperial Expeditionary Force soldiers carrying cold machines. They silently and suffocatingly began to charge. The Empire's light armored squad. Sulu saw this scene and became slightly nervous. He silently cursed a few vulgarities. He subconsciously licked his dry lips and found that the soil on the planet beside his lips was actually a little sweet. He did not know if it was because it was originally like this or because it was stained with the blood of his comrades. Today was the first time Group 7 had ventured into the side of the battlefield, and the installation of low-frequency surveillance equipment went smoothly. Unfortunately, they were too unlucky. When they were retreating, they accidentally ran into the Empire's patrol team. However, this Empire's patrol team was obviously much stronger than the standard patrol team. How could Group 7, lacking heavy weapons and equipment, block the enemy's charge? When they discovered the enemy, Group 7 immediately retreated and set up a simple fortification in the middle of the slope. Behind the slope was a grassland. If the Empire's armored squad were to take advantage of their speed, the fate of the 100 or so soldiers of Group 7 would be in danger. After a few rapid breaths, Su Li's face became a little pale. However, his eyes became brighter and brighter. He suddenly half-squatted and continuously pulled the trigger while facing the gentle slope. Within half a second, half of the bullets in the magazine were fired. The gunfire strung out of the black barrel and made a buzzing sound. It looked like he was shooting aimlessly, but several Imperial soldiers hiding behind the armored vehicles suddenly had several bullet holes in their bodies and fell heavily to the ground. The bullets drew scorching white lines in the sky above their heads. They were extremely dense. The crisp and terrifying gunshots drilled into people's ears. There was a clear feeling of the recoil coming from his fingers. He did not have time to observe the result of the shooting. Su Li's left foot deeply stomped on the ground. With a muffled sound, every piece of dirt was shaken to the point that it was incomparably solid. Meanwhile, his body used this recoil force to strangely turn into a gray line and move 5 meters along the simple fortification. He fell heavily to the ground. Almost at the same time, an Imperial armored vehicle's machine gun roared and began to fire at the patch of dirt he was originally on. A dense rain of bullets came whistling and directly turned that patch of dirt into a swamp. At that moment, if Su Li had hesitated for a moment, if he was excited by the results of the battle and proud of the shooting ability he had learned from Magnolia, he would probably have become a corpse by now. Even if he was wearing the latest soft ceramic bulletproof vest developed by the Federation, under the bombardment of the Imperial armored vehicle's machine gun, only one of his limbs would have been torn apart. Every pair of muscle fibers was extremely tight. Powerful strength filled every corner of his body. With a pale face and bright eyes, Su Li dragged the machine with his right hand and moved at an unbelievable speed above the gentle slope. He was like a shadow. The Imperial soldiers below could not determine his position at all. Behind a large rock on the western side of the gentle slope, Su Li wiped the sweat and dust from his face and curled his body into a ball. A few meaningless bullets on the battlefield had just hit the rock beside him and splashed out a few sparks. He poked the gun in his hand out of the rock and began to fire with all his might. Through the vision of the infantry helmet, he could clearly see that most of the bullets had landed on the armored vehicle. Only one of the Imperial soldiers had a few bloody holes in his thigh. On the gentle slope of the battlefield, countless gun barrels began to emit flames and spit out bullets. The members of Team 7 tried to use this wave of bullets to temporarily suppress the Imperial soldiers' charge. After all, the speed of the armored vehicles when entering the gentle slope was greatly limited. Other than the dozen or so veterans responsible for blocking the attack, there were also some rookies who did not have time to retreat to the grassland. They bravely stood up and began to fire at the Imperial soldiers below. However, their actions were inspired by courage or fear. The effect of their shooting was not good, and it was extremely dangerous. However, this wave of counterattack did not achieve the desired effect. The Imperial soldiers' formation was not messed up at all. Their charging speed was extremely fast, and they completely ignored the fallen comrades around them. It looked like they were about to reach the bottom of the gentle slope. Su Li picked up his gun and began to change his shooting location. He found an inconspicuous haystack and narrowed his eyes as he stared at the holographic screen. He asked through the comms system, "When will the air support arrive?" 2 more minutes. Magnolia's calm and quick reply came through the earpiece. 2 minutes seemed like a very short period of time. However, on this gentle slope of the meadow, amidst the rain of bullets, it felt like an eternity. Just as Su Lu was silently thinking of a way out while shooting, he suddenly heard an explosive roar from the haystack beside him. "Run!" Xiong Lin Quan stood up majestically from the haystack, shaking up countless strands of grass. With a loud roar, the Darlin autocannon in his thick arms rotated at high speed and shot out 6 beautiful fireworks. Chapter 450. The year of the tiger is coming, and the wind is blowing fiercely. I wish my brothers and sisters that the men are full of vigor and might, and the ladies be fierce tigresses at home. I don't mean to be derogatory, but I wish everyone's whole family good health, and the elders good health, and a long life. Another thing is to apply for leave until the 5th day of the Lunar New Year to resume writing. 2 nights ago, I spent the night in Harbin. I painfully struggled with myself for a long time, wondering whether I should write or not. The leader took out a coin and I lost the bet. So, with red eyes, I wrote yesterday's chapter. Yesterday evening, I arrived in Yishang, and it went very smoothly. I thanked the relevant authorities for their support for my return home. After that, I drank some wine and felt very good. When I woke up this morning, without any battle, I very seriously decided to apply for leave from everyone. I will resume writing on the 5th day of the Lunar New Year. Because it is the Lunar New Year, I need to visit relatives, drink wine, and have some fun. I have always had a dream. For writers like us, to be able to rest for 2 days a week, and to be able to take the entire year off with pay. We can't skip the Mid-Autumn Festival, National Day, and so on. Marriage and maternity leave are a must. What kind of realm is this? However, that can only be the treatment of a wife. I do want to, but during the Lunar New Year, I need to take a good rest. It just so happens that the recommendations for the past 2 days have been pretty good. I am very sorry to the editor who loves me so much. Speaking of which, there is a young girl editor in our group called Haixing. I haven't seen her yet. Speaking of which, whether it is the Suzaku story or the year of the Qing dynasty, I seem to have been resting for the past 4 or 5 years during the Lunar New Year, right? This is really something. To be able to tolerate a lazy, leisurely, fat, middle-aged man like me, who pretends to be looking for happiness all the time, but is actually a shameless, fat middle-aged man. For so long, you guys are really great. Chapter 451. Darlin's rotary cannon was a purely mechanical retro design. Its 6 large caliber barrels were semi-automatic, and its weight and ammunition capacity were extremely shocking. Because of its terrifying killing power and the area it covered, it was known as the King of Reapers. Every time it began to roar and spin, countless people would die in front of it. Its power was shocking, and its weight was shocking as well. Even after the highest efficiency of shock absorption, the recoil was still able to shake the earth. Therefore, other than the M-series mecha that used Darlin's rotary cannon as a standard, only all-terrain fighter jets and assault helicopters would use it. Very few ground troops used it. If they couldn't even lift it up with all their might, how could they use it in battle? There were always legends on the battlefield. Su Le had heard rumors before that there were some abnormal people in the Federation's military camp who could carry Darlin's rotary cannon onto the battlefield. Only after seeing Xiong Linquan did he know that these legends were right beside him. But at this moment, seeing Xiong Linquan holding Darlin's rotary cannon and crazily spitting out fireworks for the first time, he couldn't help but feel a little shaken. The muscles in his arms were tight. When he fully displayed his strength, they were even thicker than a woman's thighs. The heavy and cold Darlin's rotary cannon continued to roar. Xiong Linquan's entire body trembled along with it, causing the ground to tremble as well. Amidst the loud and muffled gunshots, Darlin's rotary cannon's bullet shells were exceptionally delicate compared to the gunshots. They densely packed and rained down on Su Li's body. His face burned with pain, but he didn't follow Xiong Linquan's instructions and immediately change his shooting position. Instead, he roared, "You're fucking crazy." Xiong Linquan was currently standing on top of the slope like a god, but he was also the most obvious target. Su Li's muscles tensed up, and he was prepared to jump up and push him down. But from the corner of his eyes, he was shocked to see that the dense rain of bullets from the rotary cannon in this man's hands had temporarily suppressed the firepower of the entire Empire's armored squad. Muffled noises of guns entering and exiting echoed non-stop. The entire haystack fell apart. Countless sharp, high-speed bullets spurted out of the 6 barrels that were rotating at a high speed and shot down from high above, hitting the armored vehicles, the rocks in the meadow, and the bodies of the soldiers of the Imperium heavily. It was like the line of an axe that was extremely sharp and chopped down from the west. The rocks were shattered into white powder, and the pond was cut into 2 muddy pieces by the shrapnel. The grass and leaves did not shatter but were directly blown into fine powder. Sparks flew from the Imperium's armored vehicles, and so did the ground. From the haystack to the pond in the distance, there was a terrifying straight line that was so deep that one could see the bones of the planet. In this perfectly straight line, there were more than 10 Imperium soldiers. Their bodies exploded into countless smoke and dust in an instant, followed by blossoms of blood that gushed out. Then they exploded and collapsed, covering the deep ditch below their bodies with the smell of blood. In the hands of Xiong Linxuan's thick arms, the incomparably heavy Dalen rotary autocannon was like an unstoppable axe that could split open the heavens. However, he was still able to valiantly maintain the accuracy of his shots under the immense recoil. This was equivalent to using meticulous brushwork to create a large ink painting of mountains and rivers. How ferocious, almost at the same time that Xiong Linquan shattered the haystack and unleashed his explosive attack, Bai Yulan's calm voice rang out from the battlefield infantry command system. In the short stream by the pond on the east side of the gentle slope, which had remained abnormally silent throughout the battle, there was no way to discover the existence of people at all. With a whoosh, a shoulder-fired rocket carried a trail of smoke as it blasted towards the Imperium's armored vehicle at the furthest edge. Xiong Linxuan's Dalen rotary cannons berserk firing in a straight line, instantly suppressing the majority of the Imperium's armored squad's firepower. Those high-speed shrapnel rained down on the armored vehicles like a torrential rain. The crisp sounds of the shrapnel ringing out were actually shocking to the Imperium soldiers within the armored vehicles to the point where they didn't dare to raise their heads, forgetting to counterattack. Only the few armored vehicles at the furthest east were outside of the attack range. They were currently calibrating their cannons at high speed, and this silent rocket that seemed to have come from nowhere was precisely aimed at them. That rocket accurately and fiercely struck the armored vehicle, but the officers within the Imperium's armored vehicle coldly continued with their operations. This was because they firmly believed that if the Federation's standard rocket couldn't penetrate the armor and strike the vehicle's engine, then there was no way it could deal fatal damage to themselves. However, what shocked most of the people on and around the gentle slope was that not only did that rocket not destroy this armored vehicle, it didn't even explode. It was like a delicate little knife that was stabbed into the deep fertile plains, nailed into the armored vehicle's outer shell. It was so strangely silent. About 20 meters away from the short stream by the pond, the dust-covered Gu Shifeng narrowed her eyes. Amidst the smoke and dust, she stared at that proud Imperium's armored vehicle. Her fingers quickly jumped and pressed on the electric contact device beside her, as if she was dancing or playing the piano. The electric contact device made a light beep sound. The outer shell of the rocket sizzled. Metal shrapnel flew into the air. One could vaguely make out some type of device that was quickly shaving off the armored vehicle's outer shell like peeling a potato. Immediately afterwards, the rocket's core separated and the second-level engine at the rear reactivated. With a muffled crack sound, it actually drilled a hole into the Imperium's armored vehicle and then drilled in. Amidst the hail of bullets and the ear-piercing noise, the quagmire seemed to have become quiet for an instant. A muffled noise sounded. The interior of the Imperium's armored vehicle exploded. It was fiercely shaken off the ground, but after just a short distance, it fell down heavily again. It was like a fragile, dark-colored cardboard box, twisted and deformed by the destructive force within. It was incredibly wretched. Countless strands of light pink smoke poured out from the cracks of this armored vehicle. The Imperium soldier inside should have been completely dead. The previously swaggering vehicle could no longer move, and it died on the spot. At this time, Gu Shifeng had already carefully crawled back under the cover of the hail of bullets from his comrades. His entire body was covered in mud, and he had long blended in with the ground beside the quagmire. Only his fingers were still rapidly operating the area's electric control system. The enemy was too sudden, and the time to set up the defense was too short. He had to use infrared methods to detonate the devices his comrades had hurriedly set up. As he crawled, explosions sounded behind him. A cloud of smoke rose up like a cute mushroom. The handsome man crawled in panic, his fingers moving quickly, detonating the anti-infantry mines that those bastards had irresponsibly thrown behind him one after another. For some reason, there was a happy smile on his face. From time to time, there would be the sound of bullets whistling through the air. From time to time, there would be Federation soldiers poking their heads out from the mud of the simple fortifications, coldly and silently firing accurately. Below them, an Imperium soldier would fall to the ground, dead or heavily injured. The berserk Xiong Linquan, the handsome and ruthless Gu Shifeng, and Magnolia Bai, who had been calmly commanding the battle but had never fired a single shot, hid in the environment to preserve the crisp sounds of gunfire that killed the enemy. Together, they formed the Shell Motor Company's 7th Combat Team. This team, which had almost all of its luster stolen by Supervisor Su Le, had finally displayed its experienced combat strength in today's battle. With his hand on the ground, Su Le used his naked eyes to observe the situation around the gentle slope. His palm was a bit uncomfortable from the scalding hot bullet shells, but he couldn't bring himself to smile. The 7th Combat Team's hastily set up anti-infantry mines seemed to be very powerful, but their effective killing power wasn't great. They had indeed suppressed the Imperium soldiers to the ground, but they couldn't truly destroy those armored vehicles. Beside him, Xiong Linquan roared as he fired a torrent of bullets. The bullets hit those armored vehicles, and the shells were horrible to look at. However, because the range of the bullets was gradually expanding, they couldn't cause a decisive destruction. Although the 7th Combat Team displayed powerful combat strength, they still lacked heavy equipment. The Imperium's armored vehicles were getting closer and closer to the side of the simple fortification and the quagmire on the gentle slope. There were about 30 members of the 7th Combat Team defending. In the grassland behind them, there were still no signs of the Federation's fighter jets. Instead, what was worrying was that the backs of the soldiers who were the first to retreat were still so clear. Could they hold on for 2 minutes? If the Imperium's armored vehicles were allowed to directly charge past the gentle slope and enter the grassland where the armored vehicles could display their high mobility and power, then the 7th Combat Team would be doomed. The density of the bullets around the grassland decreased slightly. Of course, the heavy rotary cannon in Xiong Linquan's hand was still roaring. No one could understand how much ammunition this fierce gunner had brought with him to be able to maintain such suppressive fire for so long. Xiong Linquan, to the right? Su Li's squinted eyes suddenly flashed with a strange light. He noticed that 5 Imperium soldiers were silently taking a long detour to avoid the violent shooting range of Dalin's rotary cannon. They silently and quickly approached from behind and were attempting to open fire. As the commander of the 7th Combat Team, when faced with an enemy, he did not hesitate to hand over command to Bai Yulun. That was because he had an excellent quality. He knew what he was good at and what he should do. Therefore, when he stood under the rain of bullets, he did not have the intention to stand up and open fire with Dalin. Even when he noticed that there was movement behind him, he only shouted, "Big Bear, what boss?" Xiong Linquan's tanned face was flushed red. The veins on his thick arms bulged, as if they could explode at any time. He had a heavy expression on his face as he painfully maintained the suppressive fire coverage. Even with his physical strength, he was probably reaching his limit. After hearing Su Li's words, he did not even look in that direction. This man ignored the fierce bullets and dust that flitted past him from time to time. He ignored the Imperium's vanguard soldiers that crept over from the side. He continuously pulled on the trigger, his thick lips continuously muttering certain words. ACW, I want ACWs? Fuck, I want ACW. ACW. Who can give me an ACW? Xiong Linquan did not respond. Su Le learned one thing in that instant. the battlefield only required teamwork and iron-like military discipline. In order to cover the retreat of the recruits and hold on until the Federation's air support arrived, the suppressive fire coverage of Dalin's rotary cannon in Xiong Linxuan's hands was the most crucial part. Even if he died, this man would probably continue to pull on the trigger. His mind worked quickly, but his body's reaction was even faster. With a whoosh, he flashed out from behind Xiong Linquan and stepped on the dirt of the simple fortification. He crouched down and stuck close to the ground as he charged forward at high speed, pouncing towards the Imperium soldiers that crept up from the side. In that instant, he, who was wearing a gray military uniform, was like a leopard moving unhindered through the blazing wilderness. Chapter 452. No one could use their body to block bullets, not even war god Li Pifu. But could that godlike old man dodge bullets? Sulu, who had charged out of the smoke, didn't have the luxury of time to consider this question. When his military boots broke through the mud and rushed down the slope, he already understood that the so-called dodging bullets was actually avoiding the enemy's gaze, arm, and muzzle. Then, closing the distance at high speed, killing the enemy at close range, or escaping in a hurry, theoretically speaking, a single glance could cover tens of thousands of miles. Adding on the fact that the nerve bundle had less than 1 meter of time to judge, the time it took professional soldiers to aim and fire was so short that it was negligible. Moreover, on the battlefield, there was often no need to aim, such as the 5 Empire soldiers who had made their way to the west side of the meadow. Therefore, even though Su Li's movements were as fast as a jaguar, he still put himself in absolute danger. In this universe, there was no one who wasn't afraid of death. Even the heroic and ruthless madman Li and the majestic godlike Li Pifu wouldn't try to use their own flesh and blood to meet the bullets of the Empire soldiers. However, Sula had no choice but to jump. He had no choice but to temporarily disregard his own life and death. The officer of this light armored squad of the Empire had probably already set his eyes on the west side of the meadow when Team 7 had quickly retreated to set up their defenses at the beginning of the battle. The 5 Empire soldiers who had snuck over had extremely high military attainments. Their movements were too mesmerizing. As a result, the members of Team 7 who were hiding in the meadow were unable to effectively fire at them. However, these Empire soldiers were about to threaten Xiong Linxuan's flank. Something that could make Su Lu disregard his own life and death was naturally more important than his own life and death. For example, the life and death of the members of Team 7 at this moment. In order to kill these 5 Empire soldiers, he had no choice but to charge out and jump down. He charged toward the road ahead that might be bloody and bleak, jumping into the pit where life and death were hard to say. Sulu, come back. A voice that could no longer remain calm came from the infantry system. The soldiers of the Federation who were lying behind the meadow saw that their highest commanding officer had actually rushed out of the fortification like a suicide squad member. They couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines. Bai Yulan, who was in charge of commanding the front, was even more furious and frightened to the extreme. Sulu could no longer return. After he rushed out of the construction site, he went straight to the western edge of the meadow where the slope was the steepest. Instead of slowing down, he quickly turned his feet and stomped on the soft mossy soil step by step, rushing straight down. In just half a second, his terrifying speed made his body turn into a gray afterimage. Only by overcoming the human's instinctive fear of gravity could one make such a thunderous attack. One had to be fearless. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. The military boots brushed past the floating soil as if they were lightly touching the surface of the water. However, the heavy force transmitted into the ground, shaking out deep footprints and dust. In an instant, Su Lu rushed straight 30 meters like lightning and arrived in front of the 5 soldiers of the Empire. The 5 soldiers of the Empire saw him jump out of the fortification, and the moment he rushed towards them, they opened fire without hesitation. Bullets rained down, but in the end, they were still a bit too slow. This was because they didn't expect that the Federation officer, who was either brave or stupid, could actually rush so fiercely and so quickly. While he was still in midair, The Qian light rifle in Su Li's hand had already sprayed out countless sparks. He didn't care about optical precision at all. He just swung his right arm wide, like a big knife chopping down, causing the bullets to fall in an arc within 20 meters in front of him. Amidst the dense sound of bullets falling, the shooting of the soldiers of the Empire was suppressed to the point that it was slightly chaotic. One of the soldiers of the Empire was knocked back with a muffled sound. 7 to 8 bullet holes appeared on the thick bulletproof vest on his body, giving off white smoke. Almost at the same time, Su Lu had already rushed in front of this person. The light gray figure of Su Lu was actually not much slower than the bullets. At close range, the pale-faced Su Lu smashed down with his fist, smashing into this soldier of the Empire whose face was full of fear. He smashed into this soldier's roar of despair, smashed into this soldier's finger that was trying to pull the trigger in desperation, smashed into the soldier's hard brow bone, and smashed into the soldier's hard brow bone, smashed into the soldier's body, and smashed into the soldier's body. With a muffled thud, this soldier of the Empire instantly collapsed on the wet ground like a piece of wood. He didn't even twitch. The moment the first soldier of the Empire collapsed, Su Li's narrowed eyes, which were as bright as jade but tinged with a hint of blood red. The Qian light rifle in his right hand swept horizontally, spraying out all the remaining bullets. Puff, 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 puff. Bullets flew across the swamp below the meadow. It was unknown whether this hail of bullets had hit the remaining 4 soldiers of the Empire. However, Su Li didn't consider this. His body under the dark military uniform was constantly trembling, and his speed was unfathomable like a shadow. He killed his way to the nearest soldier of the Empire. The Qian, which was already out of bullets, let out a crisp sound and knocked away the soldier's gun. The 10 postures that he had painstakingly practiced since he was young turned into an animal's instinct at this moment. He attacked like lightning, and the triangular handle of the Qian light rifle fiercely pierced this soldier's throat. Su Li's legs trembled, and the military pants around his thighs were torn apart at a speed visible to the naked eye. He swept to the other side, and his left hand shot out like a super-strong hydraulic spring arm, supporting the back elbow of the 3rd soldier of the Empire. Ta! The bullets fired by this soldier's machine brushed past Su Li's cheek, and the gunfire soared into the sky above the meadow. The pale-faced Su Li got close to the other's body, and his knee struck the other's weak lower abdomen. Amidst the cracking sounds, there was no telling how many of the soldier's bones were shattered. He slid to the ground like a broken puppet, but Su Li grabbed his collar and helped him block a few bullets that were shot from the side. Su Li's left hand took out the V12 pistol from his waist, and with a bang, shot a bloody hole between the 3rd soldier's eyebrows. At the same time, he let out a muffled groan, rolled on the ground, and entangled the 4th soldier like a wisp of smoke, and struck him with his elbow. With another bang, this soldier's head and neck were strangely and terrifyingly twisted. His unfocused eyes carried a trace of fear and disbelief, and he died just like that. Charging down the meadow, he smashed one person to death with his fist, cut another person's throat with his machine gun horizontally, shot another person between the eyebrows with his pistol, and killed another person with a back elbow strike. All of this happened in a short second. The crossfire on the meadow continued, and Su Li had already killed 4 people. His face was mixed with mud and the enemy's blood, and his body was a bit cold. Like a wisp of smoke, like a leopard, he had already pushed his speed to the limit. The bulletproof vest on his body had also suffered several dangerous bullets, but at this moment, for the first time, he felt the cold and the approach of death. Because he saw the black hole of a gun and the shocked and murderous face of a soldier from the Empire. The last soldier of the Empire, under such a ridiculous and terrifying battlefield situation, still maintained an absolutely clear head, displaying the valiant military discipline of the Empire. From the moment Su Li killed his first comrade, he began to pull away from the periphery. At this moment, there was already a distance of 10 meters between Su Li and the last soldier of the Empire. This was a fatal distance of 10 meters. Su Li had previously pounced down like a god, but after all, he was not a real god. He was just a mortal with some strange power. At this moment, he was not exhausted, and when he wanted to jump up and kill the last person, he could not compete with the speed of the bullet that was about to be shot from the muzzle of the enemy. The word give up was not in Su Li's life creed. His face instantly became paler, and his eyes became brighter. His body bounced up from the ground, and with a whoosh he pounced over. However, in such a short time, he could still clearly see that the finger of the enemy that was holding the trigger was slightly white. Was it because the enemy had already begun to use force? When facing death, many people would think of many things, such as the beautiful childhood, the green grass by the river, the first woman they fell in love with, the first warm bed they slept on, the first money they earned. At this moment, Su Lu was just a little absent-minded, a little regretful that he did not have time to look back at his history. His history was indeed quite exciting. The crisp sound of the gunshot was so clear amidst the dense gunfire. His body suddenly shook and fell to the ground. However, what shocked him was that the fatal shot of the Empire soldier did not hit his face, which was not protected by a single soldier's helmet. Instead, it hit his body. The reason was very simple. The moment the Empire soldier pulled the trigger, 2 bullets were shot from a distance and entered his head one after another. This person was so focused on distancing himself from Su Lu that he did not notice that his body was finally exposed to the muzzle of the Federation soldier's gun. The Empire soldier fell to the side of the pond with a loud crash. Blood gushed out from his throat and between his eyebrows. His body twitched slightly, and then he could no longer move. On the meadow, Magnolia's face was pale as he looked away from the 21-26 long sniper rifle. This was the first time he had made a move on the battlefield today, and he had demonstrated the comprehensive qualities of an excellent sniper. The title of Magnolia was indeed well-deserved for him. The battlefield above and below the meadow seemed to be silent for a few tenths of a second. The slightly lower frequency of the whistling of the bullets and the shouts seemed to have been blown away by the wind on this planet. Not a trace of it could be found anymore. This was a psychological feeling. Group 7 and the Empire's light armored squad were both shocked by this scene. Both sides were controlled by a feeling called inconceivable. The 5 Empire soldiers who were hiding on the west side of the meadow were all killed in a short encounter. All of this happened too fast. It was so fast that those people died tragically with their eyes wide open. It was so fast that the Empire's troops could not react in time. It was so fast that the members of Group 7 in the fortification had only time to be shocked but not enough time to provide support. It was so fast that Lan Xiaolong, who was about to rush out to rescue people, was shocked to find that this bloody and sharp battle drama had simply ended in a flash when his right foot stepped on the soil of the fortification. The dazzling and chaotic battle scene that flashed by at high speed was not enough for the highly nervous people on the battlefield to understand all the details that had happened. Only the 5 corpses of the Empire's vanguard soldiers that were lying haphazardly on the ground were still stubbornly repeating and confirming this shocking story. The people on and off the meadow looked at Su Lu by the pond. They were shocked speechless by the terrifying strength he had just displayed. The man in the smoke, if he was not a monster, then he was a god that had come to the mortal world. Chapter 453. 27 seconds. Magnolia's cold and quiet voice rang out in the infantry system. His breathing was not rushed, nor did he feel any excitement. It was as if he had not fired a shot just now. In the most dangerous moment, from a distance of over 100 meters, the 2 shots were so accurate that they killed the enemy in an instant. This voice rang out in the headphones of the 7 teams, both old and new. This meant how long it would take for the Federation's air support to arrive. Time could not really be frozen. The silence of a few tenths of a second was just a psychological illusion. Following this voice, all the silence and shock were shattered. The whistling of bullets rang out again, and miserable cries rang out again. The quagmire was still the quagmire, and the meadow was still the meadow. This was still a battlefield where people could die at any moment. The military officer of the Empire on the armored vehicle looked at the surveillance footage on the screen, his face ashen. His tone was unyielding and angry as he issued orders in the command system. The 5 dead soldiers of the Empire were his personal guards. The original plan was to sneak over and get rid of the burly man from the Federation who was carrying the Darren rotary cannon. In the end, no one expected that they would die just like that. The Imperial officer's angry voice directly rang out of the armored vehicle and into the ears of the 7 teams above the meadow. However, many people, including Sulu, did not understand the Imperial language. They could only feel the anger of the Imperial people. Moreover, they could also see the 3 Imperial armored vehicles, under the dense rain of bullets and anti-infantry smoke, forcefully turned to the west side of the meadow. It seemed that the Imperial people, in their madness, were prepared to use 1/3 of their powerful firepower to overturn the thin western defensive line that only had Xiong Linquan and Sulu. Hearing the heavy metal components and the sound of tracks tearing the ground, Sulu, who had just escaped with his life, immediately became even paler. "Boss, run!" Xiong Linquan's panicked roar came from the meadow behind him. The Darren rotary autocannon in the hands of this burly man had already used up all of its bullets. His determination to retreat was not any weaker than his previous bravery. Looking down at the Empire's armored vehicles that were turning around to shoot, he shamelessly and resolutely transformed into a streak of gray light. He completely ignored Sulu, who was in front of the camp, and madly ran away like a bolt of lightning towards the distance. A chill rushed into Su Li's mind from the back of his waist, like thousands of needles pricking his scalp. After a moment of shock, he sprinted towards the meadow. Multiple explosions rang out in front of and behind him, and the boiling soil was tossed into the air. Panting heavily, Su Lu subconsciously made tactical evasive movements, evading the crazy firepower of the Empire soldiers behind him. Looking at Xiong Linquan fleeing like a fat rabbit, he could not bring himself to laugh at all. He could only think that this bastard actually dared to run before him. The high-speed bullets whizzed past behind him, and the soft ceramic bulletproof vest on his body had countless wounds. Su Lu felt as if all the bones in his body had been broken, but he couldn't help but thank God for giving him the strong vitality and luck of a crustacean. Even with so many bullets, not a single one had hit his head. Flipping over the meadow, he ran to his heart's content. In just an instant, he had caught up to Xiong Linquan, who was already in an extremely sorry state. Xiong Linquan had used the Darlin rotary cannon to suppress the Empire's firepower for dozens of seconds. His entire physical strength had long been exhausted, but for some reason, even in the face of the fierce pursuit of the Empire's firepower, he was still unwilling to throw away the incomparably heavy gun in his hands. Su Lu could vaguely understand what De Xiong was thinking. Wiping the dirt off his face, he coughed and shouted, "Give it to me." Xiong Linquan did not react. Su Lu snatched the heavy Darlin rotary cannon and continued to run out of the smoke, but the footprints he left behind were even deeper than before. 19 seconds. Magnolia's voice sounded in his earpiece again. Amidst the artillery fire that filled the sky, Su Li's left hand held the heavy machine gun, and his right hand had already grabbed the exhausted Xiong Linquan's neck. Every pair of muscle fibers in his body were grinding and squeezing to the most unbearable point. From time to time, the dirt around him would be lifted up, and bullets would sink into the ground. But for some reason, he could not hear the roars and gunfire of the Empire's people. He could only hear his own increasingly heavy breathing and footsteps. 10, 9. He never knew that running could be such a painful thing, especially when every step could lead to death. This kind of torture really made people feel endless fear and despair. 7, 6. How long would it take for the air support to arrive? Would he and the people in Group 7 be able to hold on until that moment? Why did dozens of seconds, even dozens of seconds, seem so slow? Why was Magnolia still able to be so calm at this time and count down so softly like it was the New Year's Eve? An Empire's standard wolf-tongue bullet shot into the ground 10 meters behind Su Lu and then exploded 10 meters away. The ground shook violently, and the powerful force threw Su Li's body into the sky. The sky was not quiet either. There was a rain of bullets and smoke. Su Lu squinted his eyes and looked over. Finally, he saw more than 10 Federation fighter jets flying over at high speed. In the face of the Federation's reinforcements that had the absolute advantage in air power, the Empire's light armored formation had no way of resisting, and there was no way for them to hold on until their own reinforcements arrived. The fearless Imperial Expeditionary Force soldiers launched their last desperate charge after more than 10 armored vehicles were all turned into mushrooms in the flames. Then, they became corpses on the meadow. Group 7's combat members that were responsible for the rear met up with the members that retreated 6 kilometers behind the meadow. Under the protection of the Federation's fighter jets, they boarded the light battleship. The entire team did not enter the space base to rest. Instead, they moved to the ground base that in the evening, the faint red light from the horizon slanted over, adding a bit of warmth. However, when it was rushed by the steel mechas in the twilight, the warmth was instantly mixed with the smell of blood. The diamond-shaped base was located in the southeast deep land of planet 163. Many temporary barracks were built with high-strength plastic inside the huge base. The barracks near the northern latitude were divided into living and medical areas. At this time, the whole place was filled with the pungent smell of medicine. The low humming of the negative pressure treatment cabin mixed with the screams coming from behind the curtain, making the faces of the people around a little gloomy or ugly. Those wrinkled facial features seemed to be stuck with medical glue, and it was difficult to stretch out. A medical officer with a captain's epaulette walked out of the temporary operating room. He rubbed his red and sunken eyes and was about to light a cigarette to reward his tired body. The medical team he led had continuously performed more than 20 operations, both big and small. It was really very tiring. A cigarette was handed over. The medical officer raised his head in shock and saw a man standing in front of him. This man exuded a gentle and quiet aura from head to toe, but also contained a hint of coldness. What made him even more confused was that this person was not wearing a military uniform. "Thank you." The medical officer moved closer to the lighter of the other party and lit the cigarette. He took a deep breath. Bai Yulan smiled slightly and said, "I should be the one thanking you." He was originally a quiet, calm, and ruthless soldier. Whether it was in front of his former commanding officer or the manager of his company, he had never been so pleasant. However, as a veteran, he knew very well what it meant to be a medical officer on the battlefield. In a sense, the life and death of every soldier was in the hands of these comrades. Group 7 had their own medical officer, Monkey. Many of the veteran members, including Bai Yulan, were also proficient in battlefield first aid. However, if they really wanted to treat serious injuries, they really needed these medical officers. Moreover, looking at the tired expression of this medical officer, it was obvious how hard it was for them. Bai Yulan's thank you was very sincere. "The troop on the meadow today was yours?" The medical officer held the cigarette in his mouth and looked at Bai Yulan with interest. He said, "You guys are really unlucky." The military district scattered more than 30 teams on 163 to carry out the mission of the Bureau of Proclamation. Your team has the largest number of people, but your luck is so bad that you encountered the light armored formation of the Imperial people. "It's not my team, it's my boss' team. It's the guy you just treated." Bai Yulan explained in a soft voice, and then said with a bitter smile, "This is our first mission, and we are so unlucky. I can't explain it." The medical officer took the cigarette and patted Bai Yulan's shoulder casually. The blood on his thin gloves naturally stained them. He said, "Don't worry about these guys. Your bad luck ends on the battlefield." In such a terrible battle, no one died. However, there may be a few who need to be amputated. Whether it was the blood on his shoulder or the good or bad news, Bai Yulan didn't frown. He just nodded. The medical officer admired his reaction. After a moment of silence, he sighed and said, "With your equipment, it's not easy to hold off the Imperial people for so long. I heard that even the commanding officer of the base was shocked and cursed for a long time. Speaking of which team are you from?" "Whitewater Team 7, Bai Yulan answered concisely. "Whitewater people only smoke Blue Box 37. I always thought you guys were rich." The medical officer looked at the filter of the cigarette and said with a smile. Suddenly, his expression changed slightly. He looked at Bai Yulan and said, "Whitewater Team 7? Weren't you disbanded? I remember, you guys regrouped. So you guys are the legendary Team 7. No wonder you are so fierce." The medical officer slapped his head and said in shock, "So, The guy lying on the operating table with small eyes, is that guy? Bai Yulan nodded. The medical officer's eyes lit up. He threw away the cigarette butt and walked behind the curtain. What's wrong? Bai Yulan was shocked. The medical officer said embarrassedly, bluegrass anesthesia is too expensive and we don't have enough of it. So, I didn't use it before. He's probably in a lot of pain. I'm going to give him a shot and let him sleep. Ask him to give me an autograph while I'm at it. The medical officer said excitedly, I'm going to say that I saved Jian Shui's boyfriend. How proud would that be? Chapter 454. 2 hours later, the small-eyed man on the hospital bed, the man who had been shoved into the legend because of his scandal with the nation's girl, Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, finally woke up. In the dark of the night, on the lonely hospital bed, he opened his eyes. At first, he was confused, but after a moment of clarity, his eyes were as bright as yesterday. He looked down and found that his body was not missing any parts because of the last explosion. The stone in his heart fell to the ground with a thump. Therefore, he rejoiced and smiled happily. His neat teeth and bright smile were still clean and white, without a trace of the negative color of life and death on the battlefield. Rubbing his slightly swollen eyebrows, Su Lu looked at his watch to confirm the time. He began to observe his surroundings. He found himself in a messy medical room. It was quiet and no one came. The number of needles on the white prescription beside the hospital bed fell into his eyes. He could not help but be slightly stunned. Bluegrass anesthetic was a new type of anesthetic developed by the 11th Research Institute of the Federal Academy of Science in the 61st year of the constitutional era. Its effect was amazing, and it was safe and reliable. It could be added to all the beautiful television shopping terms. However, just like the fact that the federal military only developed 3 ACWs proved that too perfect a thing would naturally be too expensive. They actually used so much? Su Lu could not help but scratch his head. He wondered how generous the federal military was to the wounded. At the same time, he felt a bit of heartache. Then, he vaguely remembered that after returning to the camp, before the clear pain on the operating table turned into confusion, there seemed to be a medical officer who asked him to sign some form. Could it be a notice of critical illness? His injury was much more serious than he felt? Your injury is not serious. Bai Yulan pushed open the door and walked in. In her hand was a red Westwood serpent fruit. The water droplets on the fruit were clear. She passed the serpent fruit to Su Lu on the bed. She lowered her head and said softly, when the last wolf tongue exploded, fortunately, your nerve reaction speed was faster than others. You threw De Xiong and De Lin far away and jumped up yourself, but you were still injured. The bulletproof boots were completely destroyed, and the muscles in your calf were torn. Su Lu took the serpent fruit and took a bite. He said, then I should be fine soon. How is the situation in the group? In the words of the medical team, this time, Group 7's luck was so good that it defied the natural order. Many were injured, but not a single one was sacrificed. Su Li's fingers that were holding the serpent fruit were slightly startled, and he silently smiled. Immediately, he felt that today's white magnolia seemed to be a little different from usual. Although she was as gentle as usual, there was always a trace of autumn dryness in her tone. He did not understand why, but he was too lazy to think about it. He closed his eyes tiredly and began to review the course of this sudden battle. He thought about the calmness and tacit cooperation displayed by the veterans of Group 7 above the meadow. He thought about Xiong Linshuan's splitting of the gun and Gu Shifeng's terrifyingly accurate electric control methods. He could not help but sigh. After today, I finally understand that the Group 7 you brought up is indeed very fierce. No wonder the government had all those secret jobs that could not see the light of day and let you guys do them. Bai Yulan was silent. She was silent again and again. Finally, she broke the silence and said to Su Lu in an extremely serious tone, I don't want what happened on the battlefield today to happen again. Is this an order? Su Lu opened his eyes. It was rare to hear a maid or secretary speak in such a tone. He could not help but feel that it was somewhat interesting. There are 18 veterans in Group 7, including me. They are all people with experience and ability on the battlefield. Lan Xiaolong is also a wastrel. Boss, in the future, you need to learn to trust us on the battlefield. Although the Empire's light armored squad is indeed a little troublesome, we can still handle it. What is required on the battlefield is teamwork and teamwork. It is impossible to expect you to jump out and wear your underwear to play the role of a superhero every time there is a battle. You are a human, not a mecha. Any stray bullet could have taken your life. The fact that you were able to survive today only shows that you were lucky. Su Lu scratched his head again. He thought to himself that the superhero character in Master Schiller's early dramas was clearly not human. How could he be so fierce? Bai Yulan continued. Furthermore, since you temporarily gave me the command authority, you had to listen to my orders. Before I gave you clear instructions, you jumped out. This kind of personal heroism, other than being able to kill people and give the cameraman of the Venus documentary film studio a source of excitement, has no other use. Sulu was silent for a moment. Then he smiled and said, but in fact, you and I both know that in the situation at that time, there was no other way except for me to jump out. You and I know that you will never be able to order me to jump out, so I had to jump out myself. Bai Yulan was silent again. She used her fingers to tidy up the fluttering hair on her forehead. I know myself very well. I am only suitable to be a small soldier. Su Lu looked at her and said seriously, Group 7 has more than 100 people. If I want more people to return alive, I can only trust your command, but you must also treat me as an ordinary soldier and command me. Bai Yulan shook her head and said with an unquestionable tone, no. You will be a teacher, a general, or even a marshal in the future. You must learn to command on the battlefield and have the courage to do so. Su Lu knew what to say. He silently placed the serpent fruit on the bedside table. Commanding on the battlefield may be an art, but in many specific combat situations, commanding was the art of killing. Not only did one have to kill the enemy, but they also had to kill one's own people and let one's subordinates carry out certain death missions. And this was a mentality that he could understand, but it was difficult for him to achieve. The base, which had been silent for a long time, suddenly erupted with loud cheers. Su Lu looked at Bai Yulan with a puzzled expression. Bai Yulan took out a red serpent fruit from somewhere and wiped it with a snow-white handkerchief. She softly explained, just now, everyone in the base was watching the live broadcast of the battle on the Federation's news channel. Where is it from? Su Lu asked. 5460? Bai Yulan said, 2 hours ago, 5 mechanists began to attack Glacier Stronghold in the Northern Hemisphere. Judging from the cheers, they probably made a decisive breakthrough. Then, she added in a serious tone, the main vanguard is Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division. Su Lu opened his mouth slightly and sighed in disbelief. They even dare to broadcast a military operation live? Those big shots in the Department of Defense are too confident in Du Shaoqing. Do they really think that this person will never lose? In fact, the Iron 7th Division has already fought 6 tough battles and won all of them, Bai Yulan replied. Su Lu was silent. He thought of the conversation with Bai Yulan and the so-called art of commanding. He naturally thought of Commander Du Shaoqing, who always wore sunglasses and dared to treat the lives of soldiers as numbers. However, the soldiers under this person were also willing to do those boring numbers for him. This was the terrifying part about him. Many people in the army knew about the rumors of Zhong Laohu suppressing Du Shaoqing. Not long after the war with the dynasty started, 2 generals from the Westwoods military were severely punished by the Department of Defense for not being able to reinforce the Iron 7th Division in time. This only added to the authenticity of the rumors. Most of the Federation's main forces attacking the 3 fallen planets were from the Westwoods military. More than 80% of the soldiers in the rhombus-shaped base on Planet 163 were from the Westwoods. Naturally, they did not have a good impression of Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division. However, they were all soldiers of the Federation after all. Watching the live broadcast of the first military operation in history, watching the inexplicably exciting battle scenes, watching their compatriots crush the defense line the dynasty had set up in the dangerous glaciers inch by inch, they still cheered for each other from the bottom of their hearts. The light screen gradually turned dark. The soldiers of the Federation discussed excitedly before they returned to their own barracks and began to prepare for the battle that might come tomorrow morning, or perhaps later at night. Outside the barracks in the southwest corner, the 100 old soldiers from the 7th Division found it difficult to immerse themselves in such a crude and simple emotional reaction. They looked ahead with complicated gazes at the veterans who were talking and laughing, and subconsciously looked at their wounded troops and the boxes of biological materials wrapped in them. Their mood was low, but there was also an inexplicable change. These precious young masters from the capital ring, on their first mission and first battlefield, encountered the rumored ferocious people of the Imperium and encountered a sudden battle. In fact, many people, including the bodybuilders, were so scared that they could not even eat dinner. Although these old soldiers were not scared to the point of peeing their pants, there were countless people like Sheeping who could not tell north from south in the smoke. "Well done." Xiong Linquan, whose voice was loud and clear, walked back with his cane and slapped the back of a recruit's head hard. He laughed and said, "You actually dared to stay at that time. You have guts." When he escaped in the end, he was already on the verge of collapse, and he was caught by Sulu. Then he played a toss game in the end and narrowly escaped death. However, judging from his mood right now, he did not seem to be affected by the matter of life and death at all. The recruit who was slapped hard by him was Yen Bingyen. When they retreated on the meadow today, he bravely stayed and formed the last line of defense with the veterans of the 7th Division. Although he did not kill a single person of the Imperium, the feeling filled his heart with a solid aftertaste. Now that he was slapped hard by Xiong Linquan, he was a little confused. When he heard the other party's praise, he could only chuckle. Along the row of barracks, Xiong Linquan slapped one head after another. It was as if he was testing the ripeness of a watermelon. As he slapped, he praised loudly. However, those who were slapped by him did not have any trace of shame on their faces. Instead, they laughed foolishly like Yen Bingyen, because being slapped meant that they had bravely dragged on until the end today. Xiong Linquan stood in front of the crowd. Suddenly, his expression turned serious and he said seriously, "You guys did not retreat first today. You have guts and courage, but you will have to listen to military orders in the future. After all, you are all rookies, and it will not be useful to stay there. On the battlefield, the old will lead the new, and the dead will lead the living. Once you have been trained, there will be plenty of time for you to put your lives on the line. At that time, this old bear may have to count on you guys to save my life. Do you understand?" The rookies were stunned for a long time before they reacted. Some of them replied loudly, "Understood." Chapter 455. Not everyone was in the mood to respond to Xiong Linquan's boorish attitude. Shi Peng, Song Xiang, and a few other important people's young masters sat in the shadows in the corner. They avoided the strange moon above their heads and silently watched everything. Occasionally, they would lower their eyes. Shi Peng's face was a bit haggard and pale. Today, he was almost killed by the people of the Empire in the meadow. It was all thanks to Su Li's slap that he fell to the ground that he luckily escaped with his life. Right now, when he recalled the dangerous scene, his body was still cold. He used his fingers to rub off the dried mud on his face. He lowered his head and spat out a mouthful of saliva. "Give me a cigarette?" Song Xiang was slightly surprised. He turned around and went into the room. He took out a few boxes of cigarettes wrapped in pure white paper. After tearing them open, he gave one to Shi Peng. He held one in his mouth and threw the remaining boxes to his companions beside him. Smoke curled up in the night. A few red dots of light flickered in and out. Other than the occasional unaccustomed coughing, there was no other sound. No matter if they were born with a golden spoon in their mouth, a silver coin in their hand, or soil in their hands, as long as they entered the frontline battlefield and saw the real life and death around them, the young soldiers would begin to smoke, even if they were once staunch supporters of the Quit Smoking campaign. This was a cigarette specially provided by the Logistics Department of the Ministry of National Defense. There was no symbol on the white cigarette box or the cigarette itself. The specially provided cigarette contained mellowness within the spiciness. It was not bad. However, Shi Peng and the other young masters would never smoke something of this level before. However, today, for some reason, as they coughed and inhaled fiercely, they felt that this kind of spicy knife-like taste was really good. Shi Peng grabbed the butt and lit a second cigarette. It was not until his lungs were a bit sore from the smoke that he finally shook off the fear of the day. He furrowed his brows slightly. He looked at the room in the distance that was covered by the light but filled with the thick smell of tobacco. He thought of the slap he received in the meadow and thought of Lieutenant Colonel Su, who was about the same age as him. No matter what this guy was thinking, he at least fulfilled the promise he made before the battle. He was the last one to leave point 5 days later. The night before the 7th Combat Team's second mission was still as silent and peaceful as the previous few nights. It was like a quiet night in a mountain village. One could faintly hear the sound of running water in the distance. Unfortunately, there were no golden wild rice fields around the base. On the training ground in front of the barracks, dozens of soldiers were working hard to learn how to operate some special precision tools and firearms. According to the arrangement in the manual, they were divided into several groups. Some groups held heavy manual air pressure valves and worked hard to dig into the ground. Some groups had to assemble various electronic parts according to the procedures in the shortest amount of time and then put them into the small holes about 3 meters deep. Some groups carried out band monitoring and signal mixing and annihilation work, and some groups were responsible for the final disguise of the ground. A middle-aged man with curly hair stood in front of the barracks. Through the infantry communication system in his hand, he issued specific orders and operation corrections to the various groups. This was one of the most important tasks for the federal military on the 3 fallen planets. Under the watchful eyes of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, they had to quietly rebuild the electronic surveillance network so that the light of the charter could cover as much ground as possible as soon as possible. From time to time, a slight tremor could be heard from the ground, followed by low and concise calls. Although the cooperation between the teams was still a little rusty, their speed was clearly getting faster and faster. In order to infiltrate the no-man's land between the Federation and the Imperium to install the electronic surveillance network, the most important thing was secrecy and speed. It's probably because of what happened in the meadow that day that these princelings were stimulated. They now know what they have to do to survive. Bai Yulan stood beside Su Lu and said softly, from the second day onwards, they began to consciously increase their training. Of course, these kids are most concerned about firearms. De Xiong is now the most popular person in the military camp. Su Lu smiled and lowered his head to look at the technical manual in his hand. In the past 5 days, he had been busy communicating with his colleagues in the Nutshell Engineering Department far away in the capital ring about how to use the micro-turbine in the mecha. He also needed to master the extremely complicated technical procedures of the Bureau of Proclamation, so he really did not notice that the attitude of the recruits in Group 7 had changed. After putting away the technical manual, he glanced at the middle-aged official in front of the team. This person was a technical official specially assigned by the Bureau of Proclamation. He was in charge of guiding the installation and debugging of the charter network. Group 7 wanted to complete their mission, so they had to ensure this person's arrangement. Last time, when they retreated from the meadow, Bai Yulan also did not hesitate to arrange for this Bureau of Proclamation official to leave first. Seeing this silent Bureau of Proclamation official, he naturally thought of the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation and the Federal Central Computer under the Bureau of Proclamation. The Federation had made a great decision to reinstall the surveillance network. The Bureau of Proclamation had invested a lot of manpower and resources. Just on Planet 163 alone, there were many teams like Group 7 that were risking their lives to do this work. Once the various node areas were connected into a network, the glory of the Charter would return to the border planets, and the end of the Imperial Expeditionary Force would come. For Su Lu personally, this matter had another important meaning, and that was that he could once again maintain contact with the old man with a mechanical mind and a human face. Thinking of this, he said to the existence in his mind, "Tomorrow, I have to help you reattach your severed limb. How do you feel?" A line of white words appeared in his left eye from the central computer. The Bureau of Proclamation's terminology is planting mushrooms. Sulu almost laughed out loud. Tomorrow's mission will depart at 6 in the evening and will probably return in the wee hours of the morning. Let's move forward at night. The mid-range missiles that pose the greatest threat to the Imperium probably won't appear. It's just that our network is seriously damaged right now, so we can only rely on the shortwave GPS in our hands to locate the target area. Bai Yulan saw that his silent expression was a little strange. Thinking that he was worried about the mission tomorrow, she explained a few words. Too bad we can't use mechas? Sulu came back to his senses and shook his head. We can't let the Empire discover any traces, so we can't bring any heavy equipment. Our small groups are like little girls planting mushrooms in the dark. How long will it take to fill this planet with mushrooms? Bai Yulan looked at him with a strange expression. Looking at Su Li's serious expression, she confirmed that he really did not know about the famous erotic joke, so she could only lower her head. Although those extremely expensive drugs were approved by the medical officer in exchange for my signature, I still find it very strange. The equipment and supplies of this remote rhombus-shaped base seem to be much better than expected. Sulu turned his head to look at Bai Yulan and said, also, the air support on the meadow that day, don't you think it was a little strange? It was indeed strange, Bai Yulan replied succinctly. The fighter support that day came very timely. It even felt like it was a little too timely. Those all-terrain fighter jets seemed to be wandering in the stratosphere, not caring about wasting energy at all. They were just waiting for us to cause trouble. It's not that they were waiting for us to cause trouble, but that the command center dared not let us cause trouble. Sulu said calmly, it's not just a matter of time. For a combat team that just reached 100 members, the command center actually sent over a dozen fighter jets. If the Federation really had such a luxurious combat ratio, why would the Bureau of Proclamation officials be so worried? They could just send the fighter jets and mechas over and flatten those Empire people's fortifications. It seems like there are people above us. Bai Yulan raised her head and looked at the night sky. The dark blue sky was filled with stars, but they were not dense. She thought with a calm expression, the President, the War God, the Minister of Defense, they were all people above Little Boss. As if guessing what she was thinking, Sulu smiled bitterly and said, I don't think the Ministry of Defense's arrangement is against me. In my opinion, it's the President who doesn't want these old soldiers to really die. Bai Yulan was silent for a moment, then nodded. Group 7 came to the most dangerous planet in the Westwood's border, Fallen Star, not only because of the needs of the war itself, but also because of the political needs of the capital ring. President Pabre stood on the side of the people and sent these young masters to the front line to be bathed in blood. But if these young masters were really covered in blood and suffered heavy casualties, what would the anger of the upper echelons of the Federation twist the world into? Our mission period is at least 3.5 months. Bai Yulan turned to look at Sulu and said seriously, on the battlefield, the Ministry of Defense can't really send a squadron of fighter jets to babysit those young masters every day. We still have to be careful. Sulu looked at the serious expression of the recruits not far away. Looking at their increasingly skillful operation, he felt a faint sense of heaviness in his heart. He said, although I don't like these young masters, I don't want to see them die. But in fact, there will definitely be people who will fall. Maybe that will include you and me. In the night, this young man from Donglin had a rare moment of emotion in his life, but he was interrupted by a microphone that was passed to him. A reporter from the Ministry of Defense's Venus documentary film studio looked at Sulu curiously and asked in a low voice, Lieutenant Colonel Sulu, regarding the second mission that will begin tomorrow, do you have any thoughts? I noticed that you have been watching the training of the recruits. Did you also notice the changes in their emotions these past few days? Do you think these changes can really transform into combat strength? Seeing this reporter and the cameraman behind him, Sulu quickly put on his sunglasses, frowned slightly, and said seriously, my idea is that if you can stop following us every day, then these recruits should have a much higher chance of surviving. These were his heartfelt words. Under the strict orders of the Ministry of Defense, Group 7 could not get rid of this extremely simplified cameraman. During the battle, they still had to take care of these two non-combatants, which really made him and the veterans of Group 7 extremely unhappy. Also, don't forget the three-party agreement between Nutshell Headquarters, Venus Documentary Film Studio, and the Federation News Channel. Sulu pushed the camera lens to the side and said, "Without my permission, no footage can be broadcast. I can understand this, but I don't understand why you refused the news channel's request for a live broadcast." This military reporter was very clear about the influence of the young lieutenant colonel in front of him, but he still did not understand why he refused such an excellent opportunity. Sulu did not answer this question. He turned around and left. In his heart, he silently thought that he was not the invincible Du Shaoqing. He was just a combat director with the rank of lieutenant colonel. More importantly, people always died in war. It should not be filmed into something like a TV series for people to watch, get excited, scream, or grieve. Chapter 456. My name is Xiao Shizenlu. I'm 24 years old from Maine. My father is a worker at the Federation's three-dimensional irrigation farm. My mother? She stays at home all year round on government subsidies. I also have a younger sister who is in high school this year. Why is he called that? Because when my mother gave birth to me in the hospital, my father was watering the 13th floor of the farm, controlling the speed of the water droplets. I forgot to mention that this is the only job he has ever done in his life. He has spent most of his life on the 13th floor of the farm. On the TV screen, a young man with a dark complexion was talking to the camera. There was a hint of panic in his calm eyes. His skin was rough due to the torment of the strong winds and rays on planet Shilling. Coupled with the crumpled cigarette between his dry lips and the light infantry uniform on his body, it fully displayed the image of a simple frontline soldier. You don't know how many floors there are in the irrigation farm? The soldier looked at the camera in surprise and scratched his head in confusion. He then laughed and said, "It's normal that you city people don't know about this." A voice outside the camera asked, "What do you want to say to the government or the Senate about your mother's situation of being unemployed for many years?" Xiao Shizenlu simply shook his head and said to the camera, "The government provides subsidies. Besides, I've been receiving quite a lot of subsidies over the years. My family's life is not a problem. My best weapon is the 21-26 long-range sniper rifle, but there are at least 3 people in our group who use it better than me. Lao Bai Dexiong, Lieutenant Colonel Sulu? I've never seen him use a sniper rifle, but I heard that it's awesome. I saw him play with the Qian light machine in battle. He must be awesome with a sniper rifle as well." There was no such thing as awesome in the Federation. The word awesome was automatically muted by the news channel. The mission is indeed a bit tiring. We've been on this crappy planet for more than a month and have only fought 1.5 battles. It's really boring, Xiao Shizenlu said seriously. Of course, we all know that once we encounter the enemy of the Empire, if we are not well prepared, it will really be fatal. The camera was slightly tilted up at his dusty and tired face. Behind him was a messy bush. From the angle of the camera, the person holding the camera should be lying on the ground. This might be a break in the battle. You know that our mission is top secret. Then why? Is there a problem? I finally understand why Boss and Lao Bai hate you guys so much. After a period of self-expression, 13th floor gradually got used to the feeling of facing the camera. The 7 groups of ruffians that were previously hidden by his simple and honest appearance finally revealed a little. All right. He waved his hand angrily at the camera and said, "I knew I had to answer. Beep. If I had known, I wouldn't have made that bet last night. Lu Jiao and those bastards insisted that I accept your interview. Yes, I have been in the army for many years. I am a veteran. What do you think of these new recruits? I have no opinion. That's right, this brat is now in the same dorm as me. You're asking me about my relationship with him?" 13th Wang glanced to the left of the camera and smiled mockingly. These new recruits are much stronger than before. What I don't like the most about this kid is that he loves to bathe too much. He is clearly a man, yet he makes himself smell good all day. The camera shifted to the left, and a young man's face that was distorted due to anger entered the camera. After seeing the camera, The young man panicked and quickly said, "Don't film me, don't film me." The camera didn't move away. Unable to win against the persistence of the camera, the young man had no choice. After a moment of silence, he angrily explained, "I only bathe once every 3 days. The frequency has decreased a lot. I don't understand why these old soldiers don't care about personal hygiene. What I care about is being alive." 13th floor's disdainful voice came from outside the camera. "My name is Da Vinci." The new recruit was silent for a moment. A slight smile rose to his face. "I am 22 years old this year. Yes, my father is the governor of Xixia State, Dechingren. I am now in the same dorm as the guy you just interviewed. Why did you choose this name?" After mother stopped performing at Xixia Theater, she fell in love with painting. On the day she gave birth to me, my father happened to be working at an excavation site before the catastrophe. Yes, it was the discovery that shocked the Federation 20 years ago. My father saw the archaeologists take out a pile of chains and watermelon knives with Da Vinci's name on them from the basement. Just with junk, so he decided to name me Da Vinci. Da Vinci said with some sadness. Afterwards, it was proven that this was just another prank by Master Schiller. The voice outside the camera laughed and said, "But this in itself is very valuable." Da Vinci chuckled and took a cigarette from 13th floor's hand. He lit it and said, "Yes? After being on the front lines for more than a month, do you feel any different?" The voice outside the camera asked. Da Vinci seriously thought for a long time. He took a deep drag on the cigarette and said, "The freedom and peace of the Federation require blood and sacrifice. This isn't a cliché, it's a real feeling. What do you think of these old soldiers?" "Well, they taught us a lot, not just combat skills." The governor's son shrugged. "And to be honest, without them, we might have died very easily. The weapon I'm best at? That must be DI, he said excitedly. However, it was a pity that this young master had spent countless nights mastering the manual air pressure valve. Because of the need to keep it a secret, he was forced to end up in the same pitiful state as the old soldier beside him. "I can't accept that 13th floor doesn't wash his feet. His feet are very smelly. The sterile socks issued by the Ministry of Defense can't remove the smell," Da Vinci said seriously. Then, he extended a fist outside the camera and hit him hard on the forehead. He rubbed his forehead, looked at the camera, and laughed. "And 13th floor has a life dream that makes people want to vomit." As he said this, he forcefully pulled 13th floor's hand away from his mouth and said loudly, "He wants to be a general, but he doesn't even look at himself." The camera turned to 13th floor again. The soldier's face, which was red with anger, immediately became very serious. He said to the person behind the camera, "You also think that the son of a farmer can't be a general?" There was no answer. DI, isn't President Pabre the son of a miner in Donglin? 13th floor spat out a mouthful of saliva with the smell of tobacco. He laughed and said, "Besides, my boss will definitely be a marshal in the future. What's the point of me being a general and then retiring?" The camera was obviously frightened by this arrogant declaration and turned to Da Vinci. "Is there anything you want to say to your family?" Da Vinci was already prepared. He smiled brightly at the camera and said, "Dad, Mom, don't worry about me." Suddenly, the smile gradually disappeared. The arrogant and childish face of the young master became more dignified and steady. He said slowly, "We will do well on the front line. Also, my dear Shuerong, you have to wait for me to come back." The battlefield scene in the camera was gradually painted with a halo of homesickness. Just as some kind of warm thoughts were surging, 13th floor's dark face suddenly squeezed into the camera and said, "Governor, if I can't become a general, you have to find me a good job for the sake of taking care of your son." The expression on Da Vinci's face became very interesting. He pushed and kicked this guy out of the camera. Who knew that at this time? 13th floor looked at him seriously and said, "I remember that your parents and your fiancé would never allow you to smoke." Da Vinci, who had a cigarette in his thin lips, was stunned. His face was a little pale. He felt that the cigarette between his lips was like a thin and hot iron. His lips trembled and the cigarette but fell into the mud. A hand quickly covered the camera, leaving behind endless aftertaste for the hundreds of millions of viewers watching with relish in front of the TV. My name is Xiong Linquan. I come from the small town of Greenbow County in the 37th state. I don't know where it is? If you don't know, can't you check it out? Why do you care how old I am? I can use any gun. These little bastards. Well, they are really good. At least they are much better than I thought. My name is Tsong Xiang. I come from the university town of Linhai State. I am 21 years old this year. Does my father's identity have anything to do with our battle on the front line? Well, he is indeed the president of Yua University. My name is Bai Yulan and then, that's it. My name is Shi Peng. I was urgently called to the front lines 71 days ago. At that time, no one knew the specific mission orders. The faces of the veterans and the new recruits kept appearing in the camera. It was obvious that the footage was not taken at the same time and place. After spending some time on the front line and experiencing the baptism of smoke and blood, it was difficult to distinguish the two completely different types of people from their appearance and temperament. However, whether it was the Venus Documentary Film Studios filmmakers or the hundreds of millions of viewers in front of the TV, after watching for a while, they could easily distinguish between the two types of people. The eyes of the veterans of Group 7 were even colder and more ruthless. There was also a kind of frivolous indifference. More importantly, in their short self-introduction, there were even more profanities and curses than the new recruits. Countless muted beeps that represented silencing entered thousands of households in a manner that created a broadcast record for the Federation's news channel. It shook the eardrums of many people. A burning cloud suddenly floated across the camera. Bullets whistled past, hitting the bodies of Federation soldiers. Some soldiers fell, dirt was kicked up, and there were angry and hurried shouts and even more beeps. The camera began to shake violently. It was like the handheld camera technique that some movie directors deliberately use to create the atmosphere of a battlefield. However, all of this was real. There was not much blood that burst out, but it was particularly dazzling. The sounds of explosions were not really ear-splitting, but it seemed to make people feel the earth tremble. After 3 seconds of fading in and out, the camera returned to the military base. After the frantic medical treatment, it returned to the peace after the battle. This was a dusk that was as red as blood. The voiceover used a deliberately calm tone to slowly narrate everything that this team had experienced. The soldiers of Group 7, some of them came from poor families, some came from rich families, but they all had a common goal, for the victory of the Federation, so they had to walk together. In the first episode, we once showed everyone the anger and conflict that was hidden in the beginning of this unit. However, a month and a half later, it seemed that some very wonderful and very good things were happening in this unit. We are very curious. If these very good things were happening in every corner of our society, what kind of positive power would that bring? This is the second episode of the Federation News Channel's documentary, Group 7. Thank you for watching. In the next episode, we will strive to have the highest commander of this unit, who has never spoken, talk about his legendary experiences and war stories. The camera focused on a figure in the Twilight military base, and then gradually faded into darkness. Chapter 457. Amidst the swirling smoke, Su Lu narrowed his eyes and sucked hard on the cigarette between his lips. He said vaguely but with an exceptionally firm tone, "Even if you beat me to death, I will not go on camera and perform like these guys. What the hell is this? And that guy on the 13th floor, is there something wrong with his head?" He shouted in front of the entire Federation that he wants to be a marshal. In the dimly lit room, the TV screen was playing the end of the Federation's most popular reality documentary recently. The somewhat familiar figure in the twilight made Su Li's cheeks heat up. He did not understand how the cameraman had managed to capture the feeling of desolation when he was in a daze. He was even more annoyed by the way the cameraman had pretended to be lonely and imitated despair. Xiong Linquan chuckled and took a big gulp of the strong tea from the plastic pot in front of him. He pressed the remote control to change the channel and said, "I think it's pretty good." Beside him, Magnolia Bai also smiled and said, "Actually, with such a camera crew in the team, sometimes it can really adjust the atmosphere." However, after shooting for so long, in the end, only one episode can be filmed. I heard that the head of the Ministry of Defense's propaganda department and the news channel have a lot of opinions about you. Su Lu licked his lips, lowered his head and flicked the ash from his cigarette. He chuckled and said, "This is an agreement that was reached beforehand. Don't worry too much about it. I think their main headache is that you have to wear sunglasses before you are willing to appear on camera, and that you are unwilling to accept a direct interview," Lan Xiaolong said with a shrug. Su Lu shook his head, pushed open the door and walked out. The fresh air of the military camp flowed in with the wind, making him feel refreshed. In the barracks, the soldiers of Group 7 were gathered in groups. Like Su Lu and the other officers, they had just finished watching the documentary. For many of them, when they first appeared on TV, they attached great importance to their own documentary. At this moment, many of them were reminiscing about how they looked on the camera and regretting that they spoke foolishly. From time to time, there would be bursts of laughter in the crowd. Further away, in the barracks of the ground team, Da Vinci and Xiao Shisan were having an exaggerated argument, which then turned into a wrestling match. In the end, without any suspense, the son of the governor was pressed down heavily by the son of the farmer, tossing and turning in pain. Looking at this scene, Su Lu couldn't help but scratch his head and laugh. The anger he felt when watching the TV disappeared without a trace. The broadcast of the documentary series Iron 7 was another important move by the President's office, the Ministry of National Defense, and the Federation News Channel after the unprecedented live broadcast of the Iron 7 Division's military operations. Unlike the previous live broadcast of the Northern Expedition on Planet 5460, this series of documentaries focused on the lives of the frontline troops and some specific details. The complexity of the composition of Group 7, as well as the natural conflict between the fierce civilian veterans and the noble young recruits, naturally had some kind of inherent drama tension. After the first episode of the documentary series Iron 7 was broadcast, it immediately received the attention of the people of the Federation. While easily winning high ratings, it also sparked a heated discussion among the people on the capital planet. For the people living on the Peace Planet, it was the first time they had a close understanding of the specific days in the military camp. They were curious about the negative effects of the social class differences in the troops. Tonight was the second episode. At this time, more than 2 months had passed since Group 7 arrived on Planet 163, and more than 20 days had passed since the Venus documentary film studio finished filming. It was believed that after tonight, there would be a heated discussion in the entire Federation. As the person involved, as the commanding officer of Group 7, and as the person who specifically manipulated the will of the Federation government, Su Lu understood better than anyone else the deep meaning of this series of documentaries. The president and the military needed to use Group 7's movie-like experience on the front line to suppress the protests of some anti-war activists and to mend the huge gap between the rich and poor in the Federation. Based on this understanding, Su Lu had never been enthusiastic about this matter. It was just a theatrical performance for the political needs of the Federation. No matter how he looked at it, there was always a sense of unhappiness. But today, seeing the excited reactions of the members in the military camp, his attitude changed a little. He stood on the stairs and quietly watched the veterans and recruits mingling together. He felt a little satisfied. Dozens of days of life and death together on the battlefield could indeed change a lot. This kind of complete trust of entrusting one's back and life to one's companions could even change the attitude of many people for life, just like how Bai Yulan sighed with emotion after the end of the first mission. Although the members of Group 7 had special identities, the President and the Department of Defense could not really send countless iron soldiers to babysit these over 100 people. But perhaps there was something in the unseen world that was protecting this group that carried too many missions and meanings. Perhaps the creator of the constellation could not bear to see this nominally mercenary group become a tragic symbol under the eyes of hundreds of millions of people in the Federation. Group 7 had been on Planet 163 for 2.5 months and had carried out 11 Bureau of Proclamation missions. But miraculously, no one died. Only 6 recruits and 1 unlucky veteran who stepped on an anti-infantry mine buried by the Empire beside the Shy Tree were sent back to the main planet of the Westwoods by the warship because their injuries were too serious. Among the 7 wounded, 4 of them had to be amputated. On the battlefield, someone could die at any time, but none of Group 7 was willing to die. These injuries and losses could not bring sadness to the team. On the contrary, because they felt the threat of death together, but no one really died, everyone in Group 7 was in an extremely harmonious atmosphere. "Good morning, Supervisor." "Good morning, Supervisor." In the corner of the living area of the military camp, the soldiers who did not sit on the chairs but insisted on squatting by the training ground were laughing and talking about yesterday's television. Suddenly, they saw 2 people walking towards them. They immediately sprung up like springs, saluted, and greeted them loudly. But their left hands were still holding lunchboxes, and some of them had their mouths full of food, making them look especially funny. Sulu, who was wearing sunglasses, shook his head helplessly. He glanced at the film crew not far away and thought, if this continues, these soldiers in Group 7 will become natural comedians. According to military discipline, the soldiers who saluted by the roadside should respectfully call him sir. But for some reason, when Sulu heard the word sir, he felt chills all over his body. His hair stood on end, and when he straightened his collar, he also felt a cold wind blowing at the back of his neck. After queuing up and taking his meal, Sulu sat at the table under the sunlight and ate the standard meal consisting of 3 green vegetables, 5 servings of nutritious paste, a spoonful of rice, and a small string of salted vegetables. There was not a trace of disgust in his straight eyebrows. The soldiers in Group 7 subconsciously sat around him. No one dared to disturb him, but no one was willing to be too far away from him. He was like the center of a circle that did not know what to say. But because of a special trait that was difficult to describe with words, he attracted a lot of things around him. Probably only the soldiers in Group 7 could clearly describe what this special trait was. It was Su Li's brave and steady performance in every battle. It was because he saved the lives of many people, and it was because of his silent nature. At this time, a commotion suddenly erupted outside the living area. The team members who were eating turned their heads in shock and saw that under a wild tree, the delicate Gu Shifeng was arguing angrily with the curly-haired technical officer from the Bureau of Proclamation. Gu Shifeng was the best electronic technician in Group 7. All of the command and control system maintenance work was done by him. Group 7 was carrying out the Bureau of Proclamation's task of reconstructing the network on Planet 163, so he naturally had to represent Group 7 and cooperate with the technical officer from the Bureau of Proclamation. But for some reason, the usually calm Gu Shifeng was actually so angry. Sulu looked in that direction and put down the plastic spoon in his hand. He asked in confusion, "What's going on?" In the previous missions, the Bureau of Proclamation would always arrive at the target area before giving us the technical specifications and parameters. For the team members, not only do they have to avoid the eyes of the Empire's people, but they also have to take over at the last minute. This is too difficult. Bai Yulan glanced at him and explained, "This matter was mentioned in the last meeting. You asked Gu Shifeng to contact the Bureau of Proclamation official and try to obtain the specifications and parameters in advance. I think the other party's reaction will be very intense." Sulu nodded and looked in that direction quietly. With his extraordinary hearing, he clearly heard the words of the Bureau of Proclamation official. The Bureau of Proclamation official used confidentiality rules to coldly reject Group 7's request, but what really made Gu Shifeng angry was that the Bureau of Proclamation showed no regard for the lives of the team members. In the social structure of the Federation, the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation was always at the top. Somewhere in the clouds, the officials who served the Bureau of Proclamation naturally had an unpleasant sense of superiority and indifference. Su Li's eyebrows furrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything in the end. He just lowered his head and continued to eat. When Gu Shifeng walked into the cafeteria angrily, he gave her a comforting smile. He knew very well in his heart that a detached but extremely mechanical and bureaucratic organization like the Bureau of Proclamation, for the dozens of teams like Group 7 on this planet, was truly an unparalleled weapon that would make friends happy. However, even though he was the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation, in front of the Bureau of Proclamation, he still didn't have much power to speak. Under the gaze of the members of Group 7, he put down his plate and walked in front of the curly-haired Bureau of Proclamation official. After a moment of silence, he said in an extremely serious tone, "The Bureau of Proclamation has its rules, and the army has its traditions. Since you are not willing to temporarily give up on those ridiculous confidentiality rules for the sake of the survival of your soldiers, then I must remind you that if my people pay the price of unnecessary casualties because of your stupidity and conservatism, I will seek justice from Director C." The official looked at Sulu calmly. He didn't back down at all because of this threat, nor did he show any fear because he mentioned Director C. He was just as cold and rigid as the Federal Central Computer. Chapter 458. Cold and stubborn, like a stone thrown into the depths of Glacier 5460. Sulu was not unfamiliar with this personality. After leaving Donglin, he had met many people like this. He had made some guesses about the personality of the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation official, but he did not expect such a cold and stubborn official with absolute power to be able to remain so calm and silent in the past few days of work. He was so calm and silent that he did not even have a sense of existence. Until this sunny lunchtime, Sulu was shocked to find that he still could not remember the name of the person. It can't be a robot, right? He looked at the curly hair on the Bureau of Proclamation official's post with a bitter smile. There seemed to be no better way to deal with such a stubborn person other than to turn around and prepare for the mission in the afternoon. After lunch, the members of Team 7 who were already used to the mission process skillfully organized their light equipment and firearms. They divided into 2 teams, walked out of the gate of the military camp, and drove toward the relay base in military vehicles. The simple road outside the military camp was filled with all kinds of vehicles. On the hills in the distance, there were heavy military M52 mechas slowly moving forward. The speed of the fleet was much slower than usual. Sulu sat in the passenger seat and said worriedly, "Is the general attack about to begin?" But the progress of laying the net is still a long way off. Since 6 days ago, the Federal fleet suspended in the space of Planet 163 began to send combat personnel and heavy equipment to the ground at a frequency that was several times faster than normal. For a few nights in a row, the sky was brightly lit by the lights of the heavy transport ships. Under the cover of the fierce aerial firepower, at least 7 mechanists landed in various areas of the planet. Team 7 stopped at the side of the road and made way for the multi-axle heavy truck in front of them. The team members looked at the missile on top of the heavy truck in silence. They were slightly excited but also a little nervous. The Westwoods Military District is under too much pressure. The ground military operations of Planet 163 and Planet 3320 have been stagnant for more than 2 months. The Federation Parliament has been impatient for a long time, and the President can't let Commander Zhong drag this out forever. Bai Yulan lit a cigarette and continued, "This is a Hurricane 2 missile. The missile base behind the mountain should be on standby. The general attack will not be later than this week." "Why are you in such a hurry?" Sulu agreed inside. With so many groups laying the net, the longer the net is laid, the more protection the soldiers will have during the general attack. They can't bring it forward because of political pressure. Bai Yulan took a puff of her cigarette and sighed softly. They were just ordinary members of the army and couldn't influence the overall battle situation. More than a dozen multi-axle heavy trucks that stretched for several kilometers slowly drove toward the missile base behind the mountain. More than half an hour had passed since the convoy started moving again. However, not long after the convoy started moving, they were forced to stop again. Tin Peng, who was sitting in the back seat, cursed angrily. After entering the front line, the nephew of the Deputy Speaker of the Federation was transferred to Su Li's side as a field commander and liaison soldier. It seemed that because of his identity, the people deliberately let him get close to the leaders of the army so that he would be safer. But in reality, everyone in Group 7 knew that this was not the case. In the few battles that occurred, Su Lu, as the highest military commander, would always appear in the most tense areas and be the last to leave the battlefield. Following behind this young master, not only did they not enjoy the treatment of the leader leaving first, but they also had to bear more dangers. Perhaps it was because of individual differences, perhaps it was because he felt the hostility of the officers in Group 7, or perhaps it was because he thought that they were deliberately torturing him. Tin Peng's mood was not as good as his companions. On the contrary, he was somewhat depressed. After being blocked for so long, he finally couldn't help but curse. "Shut up." Su Lu turned around and glanced at him. He took off the sunglasses on the bridge of his nose, and a trace of anger and coldness flashed through his eyes. At the same time, the other people in the car also gave him a fierce stare. Tin Peng was stunned, but he didn't have the courage to refute. Group 7 was a strange team. Other than the direct military orders of the Ministry of Defense, all the rules were Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's words. This may be an unspoken rule, but it was an unspoken rule that no one in Group 7 dared to disobey. A lone military vehicle drove in front of the base. The body of the vehicle was old and shabby, and it was not eye-catching. However, including Group 7's fleet, hundreds of military vehicles stopped at the roadside at the same time, quietly and respectfully waiting for this military vehicle to pass. A trace of shock flashed through Tin Peng's eyes. He finally understood why the officers in the car looked at him with that gaze. The probing attack on the Rocky Mountain district began last night. Bai Yulan stared at the military vehicle and said in a calm voice, "More than 300 people died." After saying this, he pushed open the door and walked out. Su Lu held his sunglasses tightly and also walked out. Then, everyone walked under the military vehicle and stood on both sides of the road. They took off the military hats on their heads and silently raised their hands in salute. On that lone military vehicle, there was a black coffin that only had a symbolic meaning. With the cruelty of modern interstellar warfare, it was very difficult to preserve the romantic scene of dying in battle. The federal military had always used this kind of simple ceremony to bid farewell to their comrades. The black coffin was covered with a bright Federation military flag. Countless bones were buried on this planet. High in the back of Macho Mountain, Lady Tai turned off the television. She habitually picked up the moist and ancient fragrant agarwood and then put it down. She was silent for a long time. Tonight at the reception on Parliament Mountain, many people secretly cursed President Pabre for deliberately putting on this show in order to obtain political capital, Secretary Shen said calmly. Secretary Shen said calmly, "There are also some people who have made presumptuous comments in private. If His Excellency the President is truly a selfless person, he should throw the Crown Prince to Celine if he has the ability." Thinking of the news she had just received from the front line in the West Woods, Lady Tai's expression changed slightly, revealing a trace of mockery and tiredness. Her only son, who had an incomparably honorable status, had officially resigned from his position as the confidential secretary of the Westwoods Commander's Staff Department 7 hours ago. He had landed on the planet's surface and entered the most dangerous Jolene base. The circle that she represented was indeed filled with incompetent fools and fools who had no foresight. However, as the head of the Tai family, she could never completely cut herself off from that circle, because that circle was her circle to begin with. At this moment, Butler Jean quietly walked in from the side and took out a few thin sheets of plant fiber paper. He placed them on the table and said softly, "The Federation Investigation Bureau has sent a message that several very professional people have illegally entered the West Woods from Bermuda. Their target may be Sulu." Lady Tai's expression was calm. She did not even look at the file. Instead, she directly asked Shen Li, "What do you think?" Secretary Shen was a person who was qualified to enter the Trinity Association. He did not spread the bloodshed in the West Woods like Du Shaoqing, nor did he do those terrible things like Shi Qinghai. Since he graduated from No. 1 Hospital, he had been living peacefully in the Xiao Shu Foundation until he was promoted to Lady Tai's confidential secretary a few years ago. When he heard his wife's words, he was slightly stunned. His lips were dry, and he knew that he was finally going to enter the real decision-making circle of the Qianshi family. After a moment of silence, Secretary Shen seriously replied, "At this time, the people who dare to have the idea of killing Su Lu must be crazy but powerful. Su Lu has offended many people, but within this circle, it should be Nan Mingxiu, Lin Dohai, Zhong Ziki, and Li Xiuzhu. The eldest son of the Li family has been very quiet recently." Butler Jin said in an old voice. Even after the scandal about Jian Shuer came out, he did not do anything strange. After the presidential election, Li Xiuzhu has become more honest and has improved a lot. Even if he hates Su Lu to the core, he would not dare to interfere in this matter. Lady Tai looked at the agarwood and gently rubbed her soft fingertips. She said, "Although the two most useless juniors of the 7 major families and the son of a bumpkin. Although they are a bunch of useless people, they still have a strong background. When their anger is gathered together, it should be able to bring some warmth." She slowly closed her eyes. After a long silence, she sighed and said, "Even Taizion could not persuade him. Does this little guy really think that he is the second old man? This kind of stubborn little guy who does not see the big picture and only knows how to ruin things should not exist in this world. Although he rejected the young master, this is after all the president's plan. It has little to do with him." Secretary Shen hesitated for a moment and bravely expressed his opinion. "He is the successor chosen by the military god. After the victory of the military operation, he will return to the capital ring. I am afraid that he will face the anger of many people. At this time, if we help him, we are actually helping ourselves." Secretary Shen didn't say it explicitly, but he had clearly expressed the meaning of providing timely help and a rare commodity that could be hoarded. "What do you mean by help? He will not appreciate it, and I am not in the mood for it." Lady Tai opened her eyes and looked at the ice lake. With the military's efforts to cultivate him, the news that someone wants to kill him will not be hidden for long. While the old man is alive, I will maintain my respect for him and see what kind of future Su Lu will have. Of course, I will not think highly of those stupid young masters, but I am very curious. If someone comes to stroke the tiger's whiskers, what kind of intense reaction will Su Lu, this little tiger, have? Of course, the prerequisite is that he can come back alive from the front line. She had seen through the ups and downs of the Federation in the past few decades. She knew very well that anything could happen on the battlefield. A stray bullet or a rock could kill a future famous general of the Federation. During the war between the Federation and the Empire that lasted for many years, how many talented and strong-willed young people like Su Lu were mercilessly cut down like countless trees. The madam silently recalled the past. After a moment, she slowly stood up and walked out of the balcony. Chapter 459. Secondly, I'm taking leave today. It's not that I'm tired, it's not that I don't have time. I'm not tired at all today. I even went out to play for a while in the afternoon. I definitely have time to write. Even if I start writing now, I'll definitely be able to write 3,000 words by tonight. It's just that my mood isn't right. In the evening, I drank 2 glasses of wine with my father and chatted for a while. I suddenly remembered that when I was young, I often heard my father talk about his old days as a soldier in Tibet. There's nothing to be sentimental about. It's just that the story of the spy is about to enter a more hot-blooded phase. I can't find the point where I feel that way. My life has been joyful and trivial for too long. I sat in front of the computer for a while. I even thought about spelling with my friends, but I still wrote and deleted it. I have to write well. I have to write something slightly better. I didn't give myself enough psychological preparation at the beginning today. This is a serious problem with my writing attitude recently. I sincerely apologize to everyone. And then there's the most important thing. Ever since I got my license, I've never stopped writing. I've stopped writing countless times. Although it's true that the fatigue of being a middle-aged man has played a major role, when you think about it carefully, it's ultimately because I haven't given myself enough pressure. My attitude isn't correct enough like what I said earlier. I've said in the past that my work is my interest. It doesn't necessarily have any meaning. It's just to entertain everyone. It's to help you pass the time of your precious or leisurely time. But when you think about it more deeply, life is actually all about using various methods to pass the time. So the method is actually very important. In other words, we writers of stories are also very important in a certain sense. Since it's important, we have to have an attitude towards major events. For example, the 60th anniversary celebration, the Olympics, a house, or a marriage. After clenching my fist for a long time, I hereby solemnly promise to all of you, from tomorrow onwards until the end, this story of the spy, which I like very much, will never stop writing that I in the past. I've always been a man of my word. Everyone knows that, so I rarely dare to make any promises. The little things under my pajamas are indeed wretched. But since I've made this promise today, I'll naturally fulfill it seriously. I'll use this to correct my attitude, to enjoy my work, and to entertain everyone. Chapter 460. The convoy left the base and passed through the Golden Forest. Everyone got off the vehicles and equipped themselves with individual weapons. They carried light work equipment and entered the long-awaited light battleships. They charged into the clear sky and glided toward the dark red sunset in the distance. They landed in a remote corner of the Rocky Mountain Range. Throughout the entire process, Team 7 was silent. The lone military vehicle that entered the base and the black coffin on the vehicle seemed to be still in the eyes of all the members. Their minds were heavy and cold. The high temperature and terrifying destructive power of modern warfare made it difficult for the brave soldiers to keep their dignity intact after death. Most of the soldiers' bodies would not be brought back to the main planet of the West Woods or the Capital Ring. Instead, they would be buried on these remote planets. This was the usual practice of the federal military. From the marshal to the ordinary soldiers, all the people of the Federation firmly believed that the place where they finally fell and died was the land of the Federation. After leaving the light battleship, the 100 or so people rested for a while. Then, they began to follow the mission details they had just received. Under the cover of the twilight, they walked toward a deep valley in the Rocky Mountain Range. A slightly strange atmosphere still shrouded the silent Team 7. Along the way, only the sound of military boots stepping on fallen leaves and the soft chirping of birds and insects could be heard. Shipeng carried the heavy workbench and followed the team with difficulty. His gaze passed through the transparent infantry helmet and fell on Su Li's back. After staying on the front lines for so many days, he could already erase the cold arrogance and tyrannical attitude of the speaker's son. However, he still kept a lot of it in his bones. But for some reason, when he looked at Su Li now, it was very difficult to summon the hatred that could spontaneously arise at any time. There was indeed nothing to hate. In these days of missions and battles, Su Li had kept his promise and always stood in the most dangerous place. Thinking of the black coffin ceremony he saw on the road, Shipeng's expression became slightly solemn. The troops had a probing attack last night, and hundreds of comrades had died. Compared to the field troops, Team 7, who had not lost a single person until today, was really very relaxed and lucky. Because of the military vehicle and the black coffin, there were many new recruits who felt emotional and inferior like Shipeng. That was why the team in the valley was so silent and calm that Su Li turned his head to look at his teammates at the woodlands. He noticed that many of them were breathing heavily, but their expressions were more relaxed. He couldn't help but feel a little more relaxed. After going through 10 days of brutal training in the Westwoods military camp, these guys also knew that they had taken the initiative to train more in the past 2 months. Their military qualities had improved a lot. These young men who were still young soldiers 2 months ago could now carry the technical components of the Bureau of Proclamation that weighed dozens of kilograms and march for 1.5 hours on foot. This kind of progress not only won the silent praise of the veterans, but would also become a beautiful memory in their own lives in the future. The temporary resting area was a gentle slope with trees covering the top. The sunset on the horizon had long been blocked by the mountains, and the world was filled with a slightly gloomy atmosphere. Su Li knew why such a remote place would become one of the areas selected by the Bureau of Proclamation to reconstruct the surveillance network. No matter whether it was in terms of geography or the military arrangements between the Federation and the Empire, this should be a forgotten area. The only exception was the simple and ancient road by the woodlands that seemed to explain some problems. Curly Hair just gave us the details of the mission at the top level. Gu Shifeng walked over and picked up the mini electronic booklet. 284, 822. 13 square kilometers of the axis to lay a network over a 7.3 square kilometer area. It's a Type 3 composite surveillance network. It won't be difficult to install it, but the key is that there are a few spots that might need to be installed on the rock walls. Just treat it as a vacation. Lan Xiaolong held a cigarette in his mouth and shrugged. In this kind of place where birds don't shit, even if we go rock climbing naked, the Empire's patrolling soldiers probably won't see us. No one paid him any attention. Bai Yulan took the electronic booklet from Gu Shifeng's hands. A second ago, Shipeng had quickly turned on the workbench and then obediently retreated to the woodlands in the distance. Only Su Lu, Bai Yulan, and a few others were qualified to access the specific mission details of the Bureau of Proclamation's 7 groups of soldiers. He wasn't included. The electronic booklet was connected to the workbench. Su Lu and the others huddled together and looked at the display on the screen. They couldn't help but furrow their brows. It wasn't because the mission today was too heavy or because they had to take risks behind enemy lines. On the contrary, it was because the mission this time was so simple and easy that it didn't seem to require all 7 groups to be mobilized. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the flashing dots on the screen. His finger tapped lightly to enlarge the field of view of the map. At the same time, he silently moved the fixed areas of the previous missions that he had stored in his mind through the back door. He gradually outlined a more complete map. It was indeed the back door. After every mission, the officials of the Bureau of Proclamation would destroy all the records left on the workbench of 7 groups. The complicated data couldn't be remembered through the human brain. Su Lu went through the back door through the old man. He used the first sequence authority that he didn't even understand to ask the central computer in the distant capital ring to send the data back through the back door of the chip behind his neck. Just now, they said that the general attack should be within a week. I think it will be earlier than we thought. He pursed his dry lips and forced a smile as he voiced his judgment. In fact, the Federal Army had already gained an overall advantage on Planet 5460. On Planet 163, they had also begun to take the initiative. However, it was said that on Planet 3320, the troops of both sides were still fighting fiercely. It's been more than 2 months. There are many teams like 7 groups on this planet. I've calculated carefully. At least 70% of the surface area has been successfully rebuilt. But why hasn't the charter been used in the recent military operations? Lan Xiaolong said with a frown. Su Lu glanced at the officials of the Bureau of Proclamation who were smoking silently by the rock in the distance and said, if the electronic surveillance network is used in a small-scale battle, the people of the Imperium will monitor it. As long as the location of the equipment we buried is confirmed, they will destroy it at all costs. The idea of the Ministry of Defense and the Bureau of Proclamation is very simple. They will slowly arrange the net neatly and fully activate it during the general attack. He smiled, held the cigarette in his mouth, and ignited the windproof lighter with a snap. There was a slight light in the dark mountain forest. When the time comes, the Bureau of Proclamation will say, "Let there be light." Then this planet will have light, and the evil ghosts of the Imperium will die when they see the light. In the last twilight, in the beginning of the night, between the slightly bald cliffs on both sides of an old road, the faint sound of drilling machines could be heard from time to time. Rocks were drilled away, soil was turned over, and trees were cut down. In the distance and near, if one looked carefully with the naked eye, one could see many Federation soldiers in colorful military uniforms, silently but quickly. They were installing the electronic equipment of the Bureau of Proclamation, which was originally as strange as a monster but was now as familiar as a first love, into this 7 square kilometer area. The infantry suits on them had an automatic cooling camouflage effect. They could effectively hide from the Imperial Expeditionary Force's high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that rarely escaped Federation's destruction. The team members were divided into many groups. They meticulously carried out the installation work in the cliffs, valleys, and forests according to the complicated and even tedious requirements of the Bureau of Proclamation. At the outermost edge of the mission operation area, Xiong Linquan and a few other veterans were leading Yan Bingyan and the others. They vigilantly watched the movements in the distance. At the same time, they continuously sent out folding signal interference through the equipment to block the signal that might overflow later. Su Lu sat under a large rock. With his sharp eyesight, he observed the image of the team members working furthest away. His fingers occasionally lit up the dense steel windproof lighter in his hand. In the legends of the military camp, many veterans had their heads blown off by the Imperium snipers because they lit up cigarettes at night. However, the Federation soldiers, including him, did not seem to believe in this legend. This was because this was a war that started within the Federation. The Federation had the absolute advantage in this war. All the mission operation areas were filtered countless times by high-altitude satellites to eliminate most of the dangers. Done. Prepare to debug. Gu Shifeng's calm voice sounded in his earpiece. At the same time, the curly-haired Bureau of Proclamation official not far away turned on his mini workstation. Today's mission was completed very easily. Su Lu patted his butt and stood up. He looked at the team members who were busy with debugging and physical concealment work. He took a deep breath and realized that it was already midnight. At this moment, he suddenly remembered that year 68 of the constitutional calendar had already ended a few days ago. Right now, he was standing in the spring of year 69 of the constitutional calendar, in a place incomparably far away from his hometown. When the troops returned to the safe zone transit base in the light battleship, Su Lu had just started to feel a faint sense of homesickness when he was successfully turned into silence by an email from his second hometown, S1. This was an email that the Internal Affairs Department of the Federation of Defense had specially forwarded to him. The email said in a serious tone that two exceptionally fierce and powerful experts had snuck into the West Woods in the 100 Mu Star region. After a serious investigation, the Bureau of Investigation of the Federation determined that the target of these two experts was most likely him. Experts were naturally experts in killing people. Su Lu silently finished reading the email and then destroyed it. The powerful departments of the government were currently investigating this matter, but he knew very well that the people in the Federation who wanted to kill him and dared to kill him definitely had a way to help the two experts find a way to exist in the Federation. Although the only loopholes in the glory of the Charter were the uncle and himself to this day, those who lived in Bermuda did not necessarily have no chips behind their necks. Someone wanted to assassinate him, but Su Lu did not have a trace of fear in his heart. During the war, it was impossible for the two supposedly very powerful killers to enter the military camp and come to his side. The strength of the military and the professionalism of the Bureau of Investigation of the Federation were his safety barrier. Group 7 was a group of experts who were used to killing and arson. With a delicate man like Bai Yulan and a dozen or so men by his side, even the most powerful killers would pale in comparison. Most importantly, Su Lu had to admit without humility that it was very difficult to kill someone like him. But when he thought about how he had risked his life for the Federation on the front lines, and how there were still some big shots behind the scenes who wanted to kill him, this feeling did not make him sad, but angry. What made him angrier was what happened next. Chapter 461. It was 6 in the morning, and the white willow trees on the horizon were beginning to fill the sky. Most of the world was still in darkness. The Federation's lightest feather model warship, which was still incomparably large compared to a human's body, blocked out the daylight and sunk the darkness, reflecting Su Li's unconcealed anger on his face. The Bureau of Proclamation had unimaginable high-level authority, even on the battlefield. This mysterious organization had assigned Group 7 a new mission. From a certain perspective, it was a military order. As a soldier, Su had no reason to refuse, let alone be angry. However, after a night of high-intensity network installation, the members of Group 7 were already quite tired, and they hadn't made any preparations for the Bureau of Proclamation's sudden mission. In addition, it was already daylight, so the new mission would have to be carried out during the day. The level of danger would increase by a lot, and there might be serious casualties. And from the cold attitude of this curly-haired Bureau of Proclamation official, it was obvious that he didn't care about the lives of his team members, so Su Li's anger was undisguised in his eyes. The curly-haired Bureau of Proclamation official ignored the anger on Su Li's face. He took out a miniature workbench from his black overalls, opened a top-secret electronic map, and said coldly, "The time of the general attack is set for this evening. The installation of the electronic surveillance network has been basically completed. Your mission is to head to the central junction and carry out the final test of the net-like data connection." Su didn't reply. He slowly put his hands behind his back, and his straight, thick eyebrows raised slightly, but he stubbornly refused to say a word. The central junction is at 832. 113:47. It will take 1 hour, 12 minutes, and 34 seconds to get there from the central base. I request that you complete the final test mission before 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Under the shadow of the warship, only the two of them were there. The soldiers of Group 7 looked at them from afar, and their eyes gradually became suspicious. The officer from the Bureau of Proclamation could clearly sense the conflicting emotions hidden in the silence of the lieutenant colonel in front of him, but he did not care. He lowered his head and quickly demonstrated the operations that Group 7 would need to perform later. In his opinion, he was only representing the Bureau of Proclamation and the Ministry of Defense to issue orders, and all military personnel had to obey orders. Su looked at him and suddenly said, "Fuck you, the most advanced technological civilization in the entire universe. Do you still need someone to personally activate it? Although I'm not a technical officer of the Bureau of Proclamation, don't forget that I'm still an engineer from Nutshell, not a university graduate from liberal arts." The official was slightly startled. He slowly raised his head and looked at Su Li's face. Only then did he remember the background of the officer in front of him. His heart twitched a little. An unnatural smile appeared on his face as he explained, "The glory of the Charter has returned to the fallen star. Of course, it is impossible to manually activate it. However, before the final activation, a certain operation needs to be performed." Su didn't answer. He just looked at him coldly. After a moment of silence, the curly-haired officer forced a smile and said, "You understand?" If it wasn't for the fact that Su had several backers behind him, all of whom were the most magnificent scenery in the Federation, a high-ranking officer from the Bureau of Proclamation would never speak softly like this and take a step back. However, Su didn't appreciate his kindness. He stared into his eyes with a serious expression and scolded softly, "What do you know? Don't tell me you still expect this young master to leave you an email address so you can send me a few pornographic videos? Group 7 will definitely accept the mission, but you have to tell me the truth." Su Li's voice was full of undisguised depression and threat. Although he didn't know what would happen to him after the war if he didn't tell him the truth, for some reason, this Bureau of Proclamation official really did open his mouth after a moment of silence. Since the end of the last Great War, the Bureau of Proclamation hasn't carried out any work of laying a network on the surface for more than 10 years. In particular, the installation of a network that covers the entire surface of a planet like 163 and 3320 is something that hasn't been done in several hundred years. The officer said with a trace of awkwardness and silence, "Although the Bureau has a complete installation manual, there was still a problem." "What problem?" Su asked nervously with a slightly hoarse voice. "Last night, when the command ship and the Bureau of Proclamation were doing signal debugging, they discovered that there might be a data error in the linked chipset installed at the central junction." The officer saw Su Li's expression become extremely ugly and immediately continued to explain, "But the Bureau has already given me full authority. The relevant technical operation procedures and important parameters are all on the workbench. We only need to carry out some repair work. It won't be difficult." Su Li's expression gradually returned to normal, but he couldn't stop sucking in cold air inwardly. The Federation had already decided to launch a general attack on the planet today, but the most important all-around surveillance and command network was in danger of not being able to be activated. The date of the general attack involved many complicated aspects such as command, combat force deployment, logistics planning, and many others. If the date was changed or delayed, not to mention whether the Empire would find out, the self-destruction of the huge project of war would cause the Federal Army to pay an even heavier price. He took off his sunglasses and rubbed his aching forehead. He looked at the high-end workbench in the officer's hand and said, "Give me the operation specifications and parameters." "No, this is top-secret data. Only I can keep it." Once it involved the regulations related to the charter, the curly-haired officer returned to his rigid and unyielding attitude. Sulu was silent for a moment. He knew that there was no point in arguing over this matter. He gave Bai Yulan, who was under the shadow of the battleship, a look. The next moment, Bai Yulan, Lan Xiaolong, and the other officers of Group 7 gathered around Sulu. Everyone gathered around the workbench and listened carefully to the mission description given by the Bureau of Proclamation official. Everyone's expression became more and more serious. Sulu didn't look at them. He put on his sunglasses again and stood outside the crowd with his eyes closed. He looked like he was resting, but in fact, he was secretly communicating with the old man to confirm whether what the Bureau of Proclamation said was true. In the end, he received confirmation from the flashing light in his left eye. Without any hesitation, Group 7, who were filled with astonishment and anger at the noble and mysterious Bureau of Proclamation for making such a childish mistake, boarded the battleship again and headed toward the target area. Before leaving, Sulu asked the Bureau of Proclamation official a question. "Why Group 7? The Bureau of Proclamation official replied, "The Bureau of Proclamation and the Ministry of Defense only trust you and your team." The bright sun was suspended above the bright atmosphere. The silent soldiers who were carefully advancing along the outer edge of the smooth river kept wiping the sweat from their foreheads. The team was deliberately stretched into a long line like a gray snake. Under Su Li's request, the team members who were carrying out the last mission before the Federation's general attack were reduced to 40 people. The rest of the recruits were led by Lan Xiaolong and returned to the base. "Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, thank you for supporting our work." The curly-haired Bureau of Proclamation official had already unbuttoned his collar. He stood beside a smooth rock and said seriously, but his hand was tightly holding the top-secret workbench. He absolutely refused to put it down. Sulu didn't pay attention to him. He frowned to prevent the sweat from seeping into his eyes. He cautiously scanned the surroundings. He felt that both sides of the river were too quiet at the moment. He didn't know if it was because the sun was too hot, but there were no traces of animals. A dozen steps away, Xiao Shursan and Da Vinci were using their eyes to ask if they could smoke. However, their leader didn't light the cigarette between his lips for a moment, so they couldn't make any unnecessary movements. The cigarette between Su Li's lips swayed up and down, but he didn't light it. This was the best time to have a good line of sight. No one could estimate the risk of maneuvering along the river. "Lieutenant Colonel Su, my surname is Xie. My name is..." The Bureau of Proclamation official seemed to want to ease the tension between himself and Group 7. "I don't want to know your name." Su took the cigarette from his lips and stuffed it into his pocket. He looked at the other party and said directly. The curly-haired official was slightly stunned. An unnatural smile appeared on his face, but then his smile disappeared. This was because a white bird flew out of the riverside forest in front of them. Group 7 immediately became alert. The white bird landed on the shallow sand of the river as if there was no one around. It began to peck at the food with its head lowered. It ignored the scorching sun and ate to its heart's content. No wonder the bird's body looked a little bloated. The members of Group 7 relaxed. They found this rare moment of leisure and smiled as they watched the scene. The Bureau of Proclamation official awkwardly wiped the sweat on his forehead. He was about to turn around and say something to Su Lu. At this moment, Su Li's pupils suddenly shrank. He suddenly reached out and tried to push the official to the ground. His movements were fast, but he was still too slow. An invisible killing bullet flew from afar. It cut through the air and hit the chest of the Bureau of Proclamation official. Then, a fierce rain of bullets hit his body accurately and terrifyingly. Together with the workbench in his hand that contained extremely important data, this body of flesh and blood was instantly torn apart into countless pieces of flesh and blood, collapsing on the bank of the river. At this time, the dense and terrifying sounds of guns and cannons on both sides of the river rang out boom. The fierce sound of cannons instantly covered the entire area of the river. Countless amounts of soil were lifted up. The unclear trajectories of the bullets penetrated the hard terrazzo stones and the trees on the riverside. In the scene of flying tree barks and smoke filling the sky, there were members of Group 7 who were hit and fell from time to time. Pieces of their hard bulletproof vests burst out, and the parts that were hit spurted out blood. Enemy attack! Enemy attack! Find cover! Spread out in a star formation. A series of fierce orders sounded in the communication system of Group 7's individual helmets. Dozens of members retreated into the forest behind the river as fast as they could. With a poof, Da Vinci, who was charging forward with a pale face, had blood spurting out from his knees. He fell heavily to the ground. Without making a sound, he grabbed the rocks with both hands and tried to crawl away from the dense firepower of the Empire on the other side of the river. Sule hid under a large rock to avoid the rain of bullets above his head. He didn't notice that his left arm had been shot to the left. He only stared at the body of the official not far away. Chapter 462. The sky was filled with guns and cannons. Countless bullets hit the boulder, splashing countless sharp shards that scattered like flowers. Sule hugged his gun and leaned against the boulder. His eyes looked at the forest diagonally above him. It seemed like he was ignoring the whistling bullets that were extremely close to him, as if he was on a small boat cruising through the waves. In reality, his body was already tense. Then, he inserted the black wire on his left wrist into the back cover of the Kian light machine. Almost at the same time, his left hand that was holding the gun shook, and the Kian bent down in the middle. After aiming the barrel at the boulder, the scene on the riverbank appeared on the helmet's holographic screen through the optical fiber. Tut-tut-tut. The Kian next to the boulder spat out flames and shot toward the opposite side of the river. However, a moment later, his right hand shook violently, and the semi-metal gun that he was holding was shattered by the Empire's gunfire. The boulder behind him was also shaking nonstop, and the tremors made his back feel numb. It was not hard to imagine how powerful the Empire's firepower was. Amidst the smoke and the mournful sound of the rain of bullets, he said something loudly into the communication system. From the corner of his eyes, he couldn't help but glance at the mangled body not far from the boulder. The official was already dead. He still didn't know his name. Right now, he could only see the curly hair that was plastered in blood. Sule quickly made his own judgment. This couldn't be an ambush set by the Empire because the enemy couldn't have predicted that this was a top-secret mission for the Bureau of Proclamation. However, the enemy's firepower was so strong that they didn't know how many people were on the other side of the river. It could only be said that Team 7's luck was extremely bad. Looking at the tattered miniature workbench next to the Bureau of Proclamation official's body, he made the most important judgment in annoyance. The charter network repair data inside was useless. 32 degrees west. By Yulan's voice rang out in the battlefield system. His voice was still calm, but he spoke much faster than usual. Faced with the sudden and violent firepower of the Empire, Group 7 was instantly stunned. However, the veterans and the well-trained new recruits reacted in the most professional manner. In the shortest amount of time, they found cover that was reliable and unreliable. As they dodged, they began to counterattack. However, at this moment, several members had already fallen by the riverbank. Terrifying gunshots rang out continuously on both sides of the riverbank. Occasionally, tree trunks would be hit, emitting a trail of smoke and countless pieces of hard bark. Da Vinci fell into the sand beside the riverbank. His left knee was hit, and he tried his best to use his elbow to crawl to the side of the forest. Whoosh whoosh. Amidst the crisp but monotonous gunshots, there were bullets that brushed past his body from time to time. White spots appeared on the round rocks and then exploded. The shrapnel began to jump irregularly. In just an instant, there were a few more holes in his hard ceramic bulletproof vest, and there were a few more bloody holes in his legs. Da Vinci's eyes widened as he looked at the forest that was right in front of him, yet seemed so far away. It represented temporary safety, and a strong sense of unwillingness and fear rose in his heart. He used his hands to grab the sand, elbows to the hard rocks, and crawled desperately, but he was suppressed by the rain of bullets on the other side of the river. His facial features became pale and distorted due to the pain, but this son of the governor of Shishia State clenched his teeth and didn't make a sound. He bravely and valiantly remained silent, unwilling to distract his comrades who were organizing a counterattack. Su Li's face was also very pale, but his eyes were very bright, brighter and brighter. This was because he realized that he and his team had entered a desperate situation. In the distant forest, there were shadows moving. It should be the Empire's soldiers who had crossed the riverbank from downstream and were preparing to flank their escape route. A fierce expression flashed across his face that was full of smoke and dust. He fiercely tore off the data cable connected to the back of the Qian machine gun. With a click, he mechanically loaded the gun and pulled the trigger. Amidst the bursts of gunfire, leaves flew up and shadows fell. Just as Su Li had predicted, the desperate battle by the riverbank was not an ambush by the Empire. Since the beginning of the war between the Federation and the Empire, Planet 163 had always maintained a large scale of peace. However, the Empire's people could clearly smell the sinister and terrifying smell under the peace. Especially in the past few days, the glory of the Charter was like a noose. Although they couldn't see where this black noose would land, they could feel that this noose was getting tighter and tighter. On this planet, there were dozens of teams like Group 7. They abandoned heavy equipment that could expose their location and silently and cautiously carried out the surveillance network repair work like ants. How could the Imperial Expeditionary Force not notice and be vigilant? It was just that they couldn't find these guys who suddenly appeared and disappeared like wandering souls. The Empire's soldiers wanted to know where the damn surveillance equipment was, but the Federation had never activated it. Fortunately, they had soldiers who were not afraid of death and were not afraid of hard work, so they used the simplest and most primitive method, which was the human wave tactic. On both sides of the Rocky Mountains that span the north and south of the planet, the Imperial Expeditionary Force sent out countless small teams to the dangerous forests, rivers, and plains. It was like gambling with their lives, and they hoped that they could win this gamble. During this process, most of the Empire's teams either waited for more than 10 days and nights until their supplies were exhausted, or they were discovered by the Federal Army and attacked to death. However, the Empire's team by the riverbank was obviously luckier. They just waited there helplessly, but who knew that they would really encounter a Federation team, and this team had an official from the Bureau of Proclamation. How could they let go of such a good opportunity? After half a minute of silence, the Empire's mobile mountain grenades started to bombard again. The ground on the riverbank began to tremble, and the loud noise almost covered the command in the communication system. Broken limbs flew on the sand, and explosions sounded in the forest from time to time. The dry leaves under the hot sun began to burn vigorously. Screams of Group 7's team members could be heard occasionally in the forest, and the counterattack gunshots kept ringing. A team of Empire soldiers was approaching from the forest downstream, and Group 7 was in danger of being pincered from the front and back. A sharp beeping sound rang in the earpiece. Fortunately, there was no mission area at this time, so the signal connection was not cut off. Group 7 had been desperately calling for air support from the Federation. After killing the two closest soldiers of the Imperium and suppressing the soldiers of the Imperium downstream with the firepower on the right, Su Li breathed quickly and leaned against the trembling rock again. Feeling the numbness on his back, he lowered his head and began to count seriously. 7, 6. He was calculating the firing interval of the Empire's sharp Rabbit Mountain cannon. As a professional engineer, He had been on the front line for a long time and learned a lot from the old members of Group 7. When he heard the sound of the Empire's cannon and the bullet tracks, he confirmed the model of the enemy's main firepower. When he counted down to 3, his pupils suddenly shrank. He knew that this was the time, so he shouted into the communication device, "Big Bear. West 32, look up 3 degrees and shoot horizontally." Almost at the same time, Magnolia's voice quickly added, 15 degrees to the left and right. In the woods on this side of the river bank, there was a sudden burst of popping sounds. A burst of bright flames, like a shooting star, tore through the air in this area, carrying the smell of burning and death, and blasted into the dense woods on the other side of the river bank. Darren's autocannon finally unleashed its might. Within a 50-meter radius of the forest opposite the river, countless trees cracked and crumbled, slowly falling down. Those ferocious bullets exploded with a loud bang, like white clouds of smoke. These clouds of smoke swept from left to right, forming a straight white line. The firepower on the other side was instantly suppressed by this fierce barrage. Who knew how many Empire soldiers were torn apart and turned into flesh and blood? Just the heavy trees that fell and burst apart crushed more than 10 Empire soldiers to death. Xiong Linquan crouched behind a horizontal tree in the forest, his eyes wide open. His entire body trembled along with the vibration of Dalin's autocannon. However, his powerful arm strength and shooting ability allowed Dalin's 6 lines of fire to not deviate from the direction that Su Lu and Magnolia were pointing at. The 3 old members of Group 7 crouched beside him, quickly and continuously supplying the chain magazine. At the same time, they used their own bodies to protect Xiong Linquan's safety. From time to time, stray bullets would hit their helmets or bodies, causing them to tremble. However, in the next moment, they would fearlessly crouch back up and continue with their work. Their faces were cold and incomparably silent. The firepower of the Empire soldiers on the other side was suppressed. Taking advantage of this short period of time, Sulu was like a stone. He suddenly shot up from behind the large rock and rushed into the forest. While escaping into the forest, he stretched out his right hand and tightly grabbed onto a wounded soldier that he had been observing for a long time. He brought that person along and quickly left the exposed river bank. He didn't pay attention to who the wounded soldier was. He only knew that at the beginning, that person had been hit by the Empire's armor-piercing bullets and couldn't move due to his heavy injuries. Using the same simple reason, he escaped the shooting range of the Imperial Army like a cheetah and ran into the forest. He didn't notice that his butt had gone numb for a moment. The forest was filled with smoke and gunfire. Su Lu stared in the direction of the river bank. He knew that Group 7 had to retreat immediately. However, the problem was that compared to escaping danger, his first priority should be to complete the Bureau of Proclamation's mission. It had nothing to do with repairing or many other things. He was very clear that if Group 7 couldn't complete this mission, then the Federation's reconstruction of the glory of the Charter would have a huge problem. Perhaps the fluttering flag of the Federation wouldn't be able to fly at all. Instead, the black hibiscus flag of the Empire would be dazzling and eye-catching. The person who was carelessly rescued by Su Lu was Lu Jiao. She had been shot in the abdomen, and there was a terrifying wound in the blood. He turned around and was about to brace the rain of bullets from the Empire to rescue the wounded soldiers of Group 7. However, in front of him on the right, a veteran arched his body and quickly rushed out. He rushed towards Da Vinci, who was in the sand and didn't dare to raise his head due to the rain of bullets. That person was Xiao Shizenlu. Chapter 463. Seeing Xiao 13th Lu rush out, Su Lu immediately stopped and hid behind a large tree. He stretched out his right hand and pressed hard on the bloody wound on Lu Jiao's abdomen. He didn't look at the slightly black blood flowing out from between his fingers. He stared at Lu Jiao's pale face and said loudly, "Hold on." The Imperial troops on the other side of the river were temporarily suppressed by Darren's rotary autocannon, but the Imperial soldiers coming from downstream finally broke through the line of defense of Group 7. Su Lu looked back at the vague figures of the Imperial soldiers at the edge of the forest and felt a chill in his heart. He wasn't the best military commander, but he knew that the only thing Group 7 could do now was to retreat. However, the problem was that they had to retreat cleanly. They couldn't let the Imperial soldiers bite their tails, because Group 7 still had to complete the last mission of the Bureau of Proclamation. If they couldn't fix the stupid mistake of the Bureau of Proclamation, the glory of the Charter wouldn't be able to return to Planet 163. The Federation's general attack that was scheduled to be launched in the evening would have a huge problem. The bright Federation flag might be forced to sleep again. Just as he was thinking of a way to retreat, he suddenly heard Magnolia's angry roar from the forest. 13th. His pupils shrank as he turned his head to look. Xiao 13th Lu's thick legs moved quickly. He bravely rushed to the open area of the river and grabbed Da Vinci, who was in a pool of blood. He turned around and rushed into the forest. However, less than 5 meters away from the edge of the forest, the Imperial soldiers launched a barrage of bullets. Bang, 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 bang. His body was knocked off the ground by the powerful bullets. Just as he was about to lose control in midair, he bravely used his waist and abdomen to throw Da Vinci into the forest. Because of this action, his body was dragged by inertia and turned half a circle in the direction of the river. The bullets hit the hard ceramic bulletproof vest, and a few burnt holes appeared on the military uniform. Bang, bang, bang. A few more Imperial bullets hit his helmet, and the transparent infantry helmet instantly cracked like a spider web. At this time, Xiao 13th Lu was still alive. The members of Group 7 in the forest could even see a trace of a farmer's unique smile with a hint of fear on his pale face. This was the last time everyone saw the farmer's son smile. In the next moment, the high-speed Empire's sharp rabbit grenade exploded in front of his feet. The air around the riverbank suddenly vibrated and exploded. Xiao 13th Lu's strong body was like a cloth bag filled with red paint. He was blown away by the explosion and landed heavily on a huge rock, making a muffled sound. Blood spurted out from his facial orifices and hit the helmet of the infantryman that was about to shatter, spreading along the spiderweb-like cracks. The hard ceramic bulletproof vest was shattered, and the dark military uniform was blown into pieces. The small Federation flag on his left shoulder was cut by the shrapnel and blown away by the flames and air, dancing lightly in the smoke. Then, it landed on his helmet. Inside the blood-soaked helmet, Xiao 13th Lu's face still maintained the weird smile from before. His eyes were still wide open, as if he was not dead yet. He was seriously looking at the burnt fragments of the military flag outside the helmet. Skyscraper! Da Vinci, who had fallen heavily on the gravel in the forest, saw this tragic scene not far away as soon as he woke up. He cried and stood up. Dragging his heavily injured left knee, he limped over like a madman. At the same time, he lifted the Qian light machine gun with his right hand and madly opened fire at the opposite side of the riverbank. By Magnolia, who was not far from him, kicked him to the ground without hesitation. She dragged the struggling and crying Da Vinci along the uneven ground and quickly retreated into the forest. The Imperial royal family's black hibiscus flag was already fluttering on the riverbank. The densely packed Imperial soldiers were yelling excitedly as they charged towards Group 7's forest from both the opposite bank and the downstream. Looking at the number of people, it was at least an Empire infantry battalion. Su Lu no longer looked at the black hibiscus flag that symbolized death. He also didn't look at the ice-cold bodies of Xiao Shizenlu and the other team members who were submerged in the water. He turned around too quickly, and his neck actually hurt a little. He stuffed the first aid kit into the arms of the semi-conscious Lu Jiao and let a passing recruit drag Lu Jiao to the back of the forest. He stood up and shouted at Xi Peng, who had been crouching behind a bush, "Retreat!" The gunshots on both sides of the riverbank were too loud. The pale Xi Peng looked at Su Lu absent-mindedly. He did not hear what Su Lu said clearly, but Su Li's command made him suddenly wake up. His whole body trembled. He immediately used the secret battlefield command system and quickly shouted to all the team members, 3 seconds of map transmission. Time synchronization. Regroup at the old location. Everyone retreat quickly. Blazing plan, cover the rear. The wristwatch beeped lightly. The synchronization before the retreat was completed. According to the orders issued by the higher-ups, the members of Team 7, who were scattered in the riverbank forest, quickly took out the high-efficiency explosives from their waists and threw them at the person who was crouching in the forest. Then, they used silence to suppress their sadness and anger. They carried or supported their injured comrades and quickly retreated to the depths of the mountain behind the forest. Xipeng did not retreat. As the messenger of Team 7's commander, Sulu, he had gotten used to his role in the past 2 months. He issued clear orders according to Team 7's battle arrangements. According to his gloominess, cowardice, and selfishness, he should not have stayed. But he felt that his legs were a little heavy today. The lives and blood of too many comrades made his lips dry. The anxious fire in his chest burned his body and made his body tremble slightly. There was a feeling of disdain when he first joined the army that rushed into his brain. He screamed crazily with a trembling voice. He followed behind Sulu and rushed to the edge of the forest. He raised his gun and fiercely opened fire, killing the Empire soldier who was charging at the front. Sulu saw Xipeng's figure from the corner of his eyes. But at this time, he did not have time to express his surprise and admiration. He silently rushed over. Then, his feet were cast in the gap between a big tree and a strange rock. He calmly picked up the 2126 that by Magnolia just threw at him. Poof, a clear and muffled gunshot sounded. An Empire soldier who rushed into the forest bled between his eyebrows and fell to the ground. He stood next to the tree, holding the rifle level. His eyes were aimed at the optical scope. He quickly panned his view again. Almost at the same time when he moved to his position, his index finger pulled the trigger. Another clear gunshot sounded. Another Empire soldier was knocked to the ground with his limbs facing the sky. Xipeng was lying on the rock, howling crazily while spraying bullets with all her might. Sulu, on the other hand, stood silently and calmly at the front. He didn't look for any cover. He held his long rifle and quickly aimed. Then he mechanically pulled the trigger. The slender 2126 long sniper rifle in his hands had become a sharp weapon for close combat. A moment later, 6 Empire soldiers had already died under his gun. He could not retreat. He had to buy time for that guy who had been squatting in the forest and muttering. Only in this way could the army that was retreating deeper into the mountains survive the pursuit of this empire. He did not look like Song Shua. He was still like that stubborn rock, a rock covered in moss, a rock that had been immersed in the river for hundreds of millions of years. He was not afraid of the Empire's bullets. But was he not afraid? The Empire soldiers who bravely charged at the front were knocked to the ground. However, more and more Empire soldiers behind them fearlessly charged into the dark forest. In the direction of the river, they could already hear dense shouts and footsteps in the Empire's language. Once the Empire soldiers charged into the forest, it would only take a moment for them to completely devour Sulu and Xipeng. How much longer do we have to hold on? Sulu held the rifle and fired horizontally. His face was silent. He seemed to be inhumanly calm amidst the smoke, but in reality, only he knew the burning anxiety in his heart. His eyes were already filled with blood red. It was not the blood red of fatigue, but the color left behind by killing. With a click, he knocked down the Empire soldier in front of him. However, a tongue of fire suddenly shot out from the forest in front of him. The rapid bullets hit the tree trunk on the ground, causing Xipeng's left eyebrow to hurt. She subconsciously fell to the ground. The bullets hit the upper half of Su Li's body. It was as if his entire body was forcefully pulled by someone from behind. He slammed violently into a tree 3 meters away. A few more small holes appeared on the hard ceramic bulletproof vest, and a 2-centimeter long wound appeared on the transparent helmet. With a crash, the leaves on the tree were shaken to the ground. Just as the leaves danced in the air, he, who had his back miserably hit the tree, bounced up with an unimaginable reaction and speed. Using the momentum, he returned like a wisp of smoke. His trembling legs left behind a faint trail on the ground, and with a boom, he entered the shrubbery. there was an Empire soldier behind the bush. This Empire soldier with a full beard stared in horror. He could not believe what he had just seen. He clearly had his index finger on the trigger, but he did not have time to pull it down. With a crack, Su Li's palm chopped down like lightning. He avoided the defensive measures and ruthlessly chopped off the soldier's throat. Blood mixed with bone fragments splattered everywhere. The one who had been squatting in the forest the entire time was Gu Shifeng. He was the most outstanding electrical control expert in Group 7, as well as the most ferocious explosives expert and environmental expert. He was squatting on the ground. Of course, he was not helplessly drawing circles because of the cannon fire. Instead, he was collecting the high-efficiency explosives his comrades had thrown to him before they left. His 10 stubby fingers were like the hands of a pianist at this moment. Gu Shifeng only used his left hand to electrically connect the scattered explosives around him. At the same time, his left hand was quickly calculating on the workbench. He calculated the depth of the forest, the angle of the mountain, the thickness of the rock, the hardness of the rock species, and the related mechanical calculations. As he calculated, he habitually muttered to himself. However, today, he did not have the usual carefree and evil smile on his face. There was only a faint haggard and nervousness. There was too little time, so he only had a 30% chance of success. However, this was worth the gamble. Using the shortest amount of time, he completed the installation of the explosives. His left hand's round fingers had just left the electrode when Gu Shifeng hurriedly shouted into the forest, "Go!" You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.